time a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 126 Who Can Last the Longest? After a silent night, April was greeted by another cold morning. The sun peeked out briefly before being tightly shrouded by gray clouds, which seemed intent on extinguishing the sunlight and plunging the world back into darkness. A thin, misty drizzle fell from the sky, yet it still kept the Belgian soldiers shivering in their trenches and bunkers. Their uniforms were soaked through, but fearing exposure and enemy fire, they dared not light fires to warm themselves and had to endure the cold. Some were pale with cold, some coughed uncontrollably, and some even had fevers. The soldiers couldn't help but complain, "When will the reinforcements arrive? Shouldn't they have been here last night? Many of us can barely hold our guns, just wait a little longer, it won't be long. They say Charles is commanding the reinforcements." In these cold, lifeless trenches, Charles always offered a glimmer of hope and a touch of warmth. After all, to the Belgians, he was practically a symbol of victory. However, Albert I in the command post was pale, and even his noble composure could not hide the disappointment in his eyes. "Flood? The reinforcements are blocked by floods?" Albert I asked incredulously. "Yes," General Charles replied helplessly, "as you know, there have been several heavy rains these past 2 days. The floods have washed away bridges and caused the rivers to swell, forcing the reinforcements to take a long detour." "How long will it take?" Albert I asked. 7 to 8 hours, General Charles handed over a telegram. General Gerlini said he wasn't sure, but fortunately, the artillery regiments have arrived, 4 in total. They're positioned about 5 kilometers behind our lines. 5 kilometers behind? Albert I's eyes showed a hint of doubt. Although he wasn't knowledgeable about military matters, he knew that the French always positioned their artillery about 1 kilometer behind the lines. They believed that only in this way could they provide sufficient cover for the infantry with artillery fire and take advantage of the 75mm guns' rate of fire to break through the enemy lines. Note, because the French army emphasized defense, artillery providing cover for infantry was an offensive concept rather than a defensive one, that is, using artillery to bombard enemy lines to cover infantry attacks and advance alongside them. However, Albert I had little hope for these artillery pieces, not only because Ypres' transportation network resulted in embarrassing supply problems, but also because he knew that the enemy's artillery had a much longer range than the French field guns. The German 105mm howitzers had a range of 12 kilometers, while the French 75mm guns only had a range of 8 kilometers. This 4-kilometer range difference was enough for the Germans to wipe out French artillery regiments one by one from beyond their range, just as they had done with Antwerp. General Charles seemed to sense Albert I's concerns and added, "Your Majesty, this is Charles's plan. General Gallieri asks you to trust Charles and the French army. Also, if absolutely necessary to open the sluice gates, please contact him." Hearing this, Albert I's expression relaxed slightly. "Then let's continue to wait for reinforcements." "The soldiers," General Charles asked, "should we tell them the truth?" "No," Albert I shook his head helplessly. "Tell them reinforcements have arrived and are with the artillery regiment. The reinforcements need time to adapt to the battlefield and make preparations." "Yes, Your Majesty," General Charles replied reluctantly. This lie was easily exposed unless the French artillery uniformly kept quiet. Soon after, German General Cross received intelligence about the Belgian army, and it was accurate intelligence. General Cross was quite surprised. The enemy only managed to reach 1 British infantry division and 4 French artillery regiments. "Yes, General," the staff officer replied, "the French reinforcements were blocked by a flash flood. Only 4 artillery regiments arrived in time, and they reportedly didn't bring much ammunition, so they deployed their artillery 5 kilometers behind a defensive line." General Cross was overjoyed. He had thought he had lost all hope of capturing Ypres forever, but now God had created a perfect opportunity for him. The enemy reinforcements hadn't arrived, but the Germans had unexpectedly received the Bavarian army of 36,000 men. Note, Among these 36,000 men was a failed art student, assigned to the 1st Infantry Battalion of the 16th Bavarian Infantry Regiment. Although this army was mostly composed of students and young men with no combat experience, importantly, they were highly motivated and fearless. Such a force was ideal for charging ahead and depleting the enemy's already scarce ammunition. "Prepare for battle," General Cross, unable to hide his joy, ordered. "Tell the soldiers, under no circumstances should they retreat. Advance. Understand? As long as we advance, we will achieve victory." General Cross worried that his offensive would once again be deterred by enemy aircraft, just like last time. Once Ypres was captured, one step forward would allow control of Dunkirk, a crucial port connecting Britain and France. At that point, both the quantity and speed of British reinforcements to the French front would be severely hampered. What General Cross didn't know was that everything he knew was what Charles wanted him to know, but only through the Belgian army. "We cannot let anyone know the truth." This was Charles's secret conversation with the Gallieni in the lounge. "Once the Germans suspect this is a trap, they will attack using a different method instead of a mass charge, and our artillery fire might not achieve its intended effect." Gallieni nodded in agreement. "Therefore, not even Albert I can be told." "Of course," Charles nodded firmly. "But what if this affects the morale of the Belgian army and causes them to collapse?" Gallieni hesitated for a moment, a hint of worry flashing in his eyes. "They are on the verge of collapse. Their only hope is reinforcements, and we've told them that the reinforcements are blocked by a flash flood. Then let's see who can hold out the longest," Charles replied calmly. "There's no battle that can be won 100%. No one knows the outcome until the very end." Gallieni smiled. This didn't sound like something a 17-year-old would say. But it was indeed true, at least more reliable than Joffre's constant victories. After a moment of contemplation, Gallieni reminded him, "The last attack exposed that our planes are equipped with machine guns. The Germans might be prepared. Our planes are not invincible, I know," Charles said confidently. "So I'm prepared too." The above image is a map of the defenses during the First Battle of Ypres. The failed art student is in the middle of the 2nd Bavarian Army. But he was in the 1st Bavarian Army. 36,000 men were quickly reduced to only 6,000 and had to retreat. Chapter 127 Easily. The balloons rose slowly again, and planes circled like dragonflies in the gray sky, both friend and foe. The battlefield now resembled a giant chessboard, with a no-man's land in the center serving as the dividing line, points positioned on either side of the defensive line, and command posts, artillery, and guards at the rear, all arrayed in preparation for a major battle. Albert I, watching the balloons and planes rising from the German direction, was puzzled. He asked, "The Germans clearly know that Charles has mounted machine guns on the planes. Isn't launching balloons suicidal?" "The Germans have no choice but to do it," General Charles explained. "In this weather, only from the balloon's altitude can they see the muzzle flashes from artillery several kilometers away. To deal with the French artillery, they must face the potential danger. But how can they protect themselves?" Albert I asked incredulously. "It's tantamount to suicide," Charles replied gravely. "Infantry charging into enemy trenches is also suicide, but they still did it." "That's war." Albert I fell silent. He realized that although he had been with the soldiers, his understanding of war was still only the tip of the iceberg. However, General Cross did not consider this suicide. He deployed 8 Maxim guns around the balloons, one for each balloon, so that any enemy aircraft approaching would be met with a barrage of machine gun fire from the ground. The artillery positions were no exception. Cross practically surrounded them with Maxim guns. Cross even instructed the pilots, "If your aircraft is tracked by the enemy, immediately approach the balloons or fly to the artillery positions." The machine guns would solve the problem for the pilots, Cross thought, just as Falkenhayn had said. At the Paris garrison headquarters, Charles received the enemy's new deployment via telegram. The intelligence was obtained by the artillery regiment's reconnaissance planes. The German planes were not machine guns, so they could confidently fly to the German positions and take a clear view of everything. The German pilots, seeing these reconnaissance planes, nervously scrambled to avoid them, fearing they were equipped with machine guns. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand placed several machine gun models around the balloons and artillery positions, looking at Charles with slight concern. Aircraft of this era had a speed of only about 100 kilometers per hour, lacked fuel tank leak-proof devices and bottom armor, and were quite vulnerable to ground machine guns. Yet, Charles still ordered the first group to attack. The brutal war unfolded once again in Ypres, but this time neither side fired their artillery, Only large numbers of German soldiers charged towards the Belgian lines through the muddy ground. The French artillery awaited orders. Gallieni's instructions were not to fire without orders, even if the enemy was right in front of them. Major General Thierry, the artillery commander, was somewhat perplexed. Wasn't this handing the artillery over to the enemy? He nervously glanced at the observer on the balloon, who was using signal flags to inform those below that the enemy had entered artillery range. However, deep down, Major General Thierry knew that General Gallieni was probably right. Since the French 75mm guns were equipped with hydraulic recoil mechanisms, capable of firing 30 rounds per minute, the German artillery had abandoned competing with the French in terms of rate of fire. They had chosen to develop both range and firepower. Now, although the German howitzers could only fire 4 rounds per minute, besides their advantage of a 12-kilometer range, a single 105mm shell, even without a direct hit, was enough to kill an entire artillery crew just by striking them nearby. Major General Thierry understood that once he ordered the firing, a deluge of 105mm shells would immediately rain down and obliterate them all. However, what was the point of continuing like this? Should they remain silent out of fear of enemy bombardment? Major General Thierry awaited the fate of his artillery. At that moment, the rumble of engines filled the sky. Major General Thierry turned to see several rows of Avro missiles flying in, heading straight for the Germans. They were identical in design and marched in neat formation, exuding a certain imposing presence. Attack as before, Major General Thierry asked, somewhat puzzled. His scouts had already relayed the enemy's deployment to General Gallieni. The enemy had laid Maxim machine guns like a hedgehog around the balloons and artillery positions. Even if the air attack succeeded, it would come at a heavy cost. Carter, commanding from the air, thought differently. He casually gestured to both sides, ordering the aircraft to climb. These idiots, they still don't realize airplanes are things that fly, Carter muttered to himself. However, he felt a little ashamed because when he heard that the balloons were surrounded by machine guns, his reaction was similar to everyone else's. He asked in a panic on the phone, what should we do? Bomb it under a hail of bullets, Charles asked with surprise. Do you need to do that? Carter hesitated for a moment, then said knowing exactly what to do, it was a piece of cake. Maintain altitude. The aircraft climbed to about 1,500 meters. Carter gave the order with hand gestures, and then let the aircraft attack freely. Since there was no radio, once the aircraft broke formation and attacked the target, they could no longer issue commands. It was all up to the pilots to act. Standing on the ground, General Cross, peering through his binoculars, observed the approaching balloons from above, wondering what they were doing. At that altitude, their rockets couldn't possibly hit the balloons. Suddenly, he realized the reason and hurriedly lowered his binoculars, shouting, "Put down the balloons! Put down the balloons!" Immediately, however, it was too late. Several Avro aircraft drew graceful arcs in the air, diving almost vertically downwards towards the balloons, launching rockets with a whooshing sound as they approached. Boom! A balloon was blown into a fireball before the eyes of the German troops, the machine gunners below failing to fire a single shot and offering no protection whatsoever. Everyone assumed the enemy aircraft would approach the balloons from the side as usual and destroy them, but they hadn't considered the large blind spot at the top of the balloons. This blind spot was a dead zone where the aircraft could launch a top attack, but the machine guns couldn't reach it, and it was also outside their firing range. Boom! One balloon after another exploded, turning to ashes in the air. Almost simultaneously, the French 75mm guns roared. Hundreds of guns from 4 artillery regiments rained down shells at an average rate of 15 rounds per minute on the German soldiers charging densely forward in front of the trenches. General Cross paled. He realized that all of this might have been part of the enemy's plan. But this wasn't the end. 2 Avro missiles fired rockets at the artillery positions from afar. These rockets didn't explode. Instead, they released plumes of smoke upon landing, soon engulfing the German artillery positions in the valley in a sea of smoke. Chapter 128. Can this be called a war? Sorry, I was too busy with work today to write 5 chapters. I'll continue with 5 updates tomorrow. The Avro rockets fired smoke bombs at the German artillery positions. The earliest smoke bombs were invented in 1849 by a British officer named Motley, who used silver nitrate and ferric hesperidin as chemical agents. However, these smoke bombs were not very effective. The smoke they produced only made the enemy aware of the presence of smoke. Charles used a formula that had been improved by the Germans 2 years later. They used potassium nitrate and sucrose as chemical agents, and the smoke intensity was more than 10 times that of the original smoke bombs. Moreover, it was cheaper and the raw materials were easier to obtain. Charles's task was to fill these chemical agents into rockets, which were then launched by pilots to the dangerous areas. The German machine gunners positioned in the artillery positions were quickly blinded by the smoke and could not see the aircraft in the air, while the pilots could still see the towering gun barrels in the positions. Then, rocket planes swooped down, launching rockets from their wings into the artillery positions. Although rockets lacked precision, they were plentiful. Each aircraft carried 10 rockets, so a dozen or so aircraft carried over 100. These rockets rained down on the artillery positions, instantly throwing the German artillery into chaos. Suddenly, a large fire erupted from the smoke, a fiery mass resembling a burning pile of firewood. But it wasn't firewood, it was an ammunition truck. Only 2 trucks were parked at the entire artillery position, and by sheer coincidence, a rocket hit one of them, its rear compartment still containing over 20 unloaded shells. The artillery officer blew his whistle and loudly ordered the driver to move the truck, but the driver couldn't. The rocket had hit the cab, and flames were everywhere, even the starter lever couldn't be removed. Several soldiers rushed over, grabbing wet coats and entrenching tools to try and extinguish the fire, but to no avail, the fire only grew larger. This terrified the soldiers. Those attempting to put out the fire dropped their tools and fled, but it was all in vain. Boom! A deafening explosion followed, the bomb in the rear compartment exploding, the fire spreading and engulfing nearby artillery shells, triggering a chain reaction of explosions. Carter, hovering in the air, glanced at the flames below before focusing his attention on the German planes, which were fleeing in all directions pursued by Avro bombers. Unarmed, they were destined to be easy targets. Carter calmly caught up with the enemy aircraft, aimed, and pulled the control stick. General Cross, watching the chaos behind him and the planes crashing one after another, felt a strange sense of powerlessness. This was an unfair war. The Germans possessed superior numbers and far better quality troops, yet it was like punching cotton, completely ineffective. Meanwhile, the enemy's vulnerable infantry hid in their trenches, doing nothing but occasionally peeking out to pull the trigger. Could this be called war? This was nothing short of a one-sided massacre. After a long silence, Cruz finally gave the order in a muffled voice, "Retreat." The staff officer had been waiting for this order. Anyone could see that the soldiers were suffering pointless casualties. Upon receiving the order, he immediately relayed it by telephone. King Albert I and General Charles were still bewildered by the situation even after the German retreat. It all happened so suddenly. Watching the German troops retreat like a receding tide, King Albert I didn't even know what had happened. Were they scared off by the planes? Or the artillery? In his view, the French artillery fire was unsustainable. Once they opened fire, it almost meant annihilation. The German artillery would immediately launch a counter-offensive. The most dangerous moment was yet to come. With the French artillery silenced, the German infantry would launch a fierce attack, and the two sides would engage in close combat. Soon, the Belgian army would collapse completely. The Germans were winning, if only they held on a little longer. Albert even considered opening the floodgates, believing it might be the only way to save Ypres. However, the Germans miraculously retreated. Albert I was filled with questions. Why were they retreating? Why weren't the German artillery firing? Why were the French 75mm guns chasing and bombing the Germans? General Charles initially didn't understand either, until he raised his binoculars and looked in the direction of the Germans, only to find that all the German balloons had vanished, not a single one remaining. Airplanes, General Charles exclaimed excitedly. The planes have won again. They've destroyed the balloons. Albert I followed Charles's gaze and saw nothing above the German lines except for white clouds and the French Avro balloons. He couldn't help but exclaim, "God, Charles could win this battle without us." This wasn't entirely accurate. The Belgian army was still useful. They could at least dig a trench and form a defensive line, and if a few enemy brave souls managed to slip through the artillery barrage, they would have to deal with them. Otherwise, if these escaped fish managed to infiltrate the artillery positions or threaten the king and command, they might at least create some chaos. Unbeknownst to Albert I, a small contingent of French reinforcements was approaching, led by a commander on a tall horse and followed by a cavalry of over 200 men. This commander was none other than Foch, revered by the French army. When Foch received the order to halt, he was furious, or rather, enraged. He couldn't help but erupt in a tirade. This is absurd. Ypres is waiting for our reinforcements. There's no ridiculous flood ahead, the bridge is right there, we could have arrived tonight, but we're being forced to wait until tomorrow." He's clearly hoping the Germans will capture Ypres. Foch even suspected that Gallieni had been bribed by the Germans to issue such an illogical order. But that didn't seem right either. Gallieni had saved Paris. If he had been bribed by the Germans, he should have cooperated with them in Paris, not driven them out. So, did Gallieni want the British reinforcements to arrive first? Or did he have other considerations? Unsure of the situation, Foch decided to personally lead a cavalry contingent to Ypres to investigate. Foch was filled with anxiety throughout the journey, even considering defying orders and bringing reinforcements. However, he soon discovered his worries were unfounded. When he rushed to Ypres, he witnessed France's victory. The sky was filled with planes emblazoned with the French tricolor. Germans fled in panic under artillery bombardment. And the front lines were littered with the mangled corpses of German soldiers. It was a near-perfect victory, with almost zero Allied casualties. Thanks to and 2017090213425190 for their generous donations. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 129 Automotive Technical Service Department. In the drizzle, Foch, mounted on horseback, paced back and forth while observing the front lines through his binoculars. He pondered a question: if reinforcements arrived and he were given command, what would he do? What would the outcome be? The answer was obvious: he would lead a counter-offensive, believing that the best defense is offense. The result would undoubtedly be a protracted war of attrition, with both sides continuously piling troops into the mud, ultimately resulting in tens or even hundreds of thousands of casualties. The difference between this battle and the one before him. Foch suddenly felt like a child who knew nothing of warfare. For years, his military theories, once rock solid and unshakable, now teetered on the brink of collapse, ready to crumble at the slightest push. The Belgian soldiers on the front lines only reacted then. They didn't cheer, each felt a sense of relief at having been resurrected. They all believed the battle was inevitable, and some had even prepared to surrender or flee. But suddenly, the Germans who were there to capture and kill them didn't come. They were driven back, leaving behind a vast expanse of corpses. The Belgian soldiers remained vigilant, believing it might be a German ruse that the Germans would soon return and launch another, even fiercer offensive. It wasn't until news arrived from headquarters that the Germans had been defeated, unable and incapable of further attacking. Only then did the Belgian soldiers gradually realize what had happened. It was real. The victory had come so suddenly that they were caught off guard and couldn't believe it. Some laughed joyfully, while others sobbed softly, repeatedly saying, "I'm alive. We're really alive." It was a poignant scene. Living was the soldiers' greatest wish, but in war, it was a negligible number, so small it could be ignored. "Yes," the officer replied softly, "Charles saved us again. He formed an unbreakable shield in front of us with his artillery shells." Only then did the soldiers truly understand what had happened. Paris City Defense Command. Amid cheers, Gallieni nodded to Charles. "So, this is asymmetric warfare?" "Yes," Charles replied, "but it doesn't necessarily have to be this model. It's actually about amplifying your own strengths to find a breakthrough, and then using that breakthrough to strike the enemy." Gallieni agreed. "In this battle, our strength was having aircraft. You amplified this advantage, creating an irreparable weakness for the enemy. As a result, the enemy's originally superior infantry couldn't exert their combat effectiveness, ultimately leading to their defeat." Gallieni's summary was spot on, so Charles had nothing to add. Gallieni closed the combat log and quickly wrote a line on the cover: "Asymmetric warfare, submitted to the military academy for compilation as teaching material." This wasn't the first time Gallieni had done this. The same was true when Charles talked about harassment tactics and special operations. For Gallieni, every battle and even every idea of Charles's was worth careful study by French officers. However, Charles seemed unaware of this, taking it all for granted, as if it had already happened and existed long ago. "I've always had a question, Lieutenant." Gallieni handed the combat log to his staff officer and casually asked Charles, "You know that French military theory is generally divided into two schools of thought. The vast majority of officers support offense, and a small minority support defense. Which school do you think is right? Why choose one? Charles countered. You mean? Gallery was quite surprised. Could they possibly choose both? Unexpectedly, Charles did think so. It's possible that both are right, or it's possible that both are wrong. Military tactics are ever-changing. The battlefield is a place of constant flux. This means there are only the most suitable tactics, not the best, and certainly no single tactic that can win every battle. I believe we should adopt different tactics depending on the specific circumstances of the battlefield, rather than hoping to solve all problems simply with offense or defense. France's mistake wasn't actually outdated tactics. Outdated tactics were merely a symptom. The fundamental reason for their tactical backwardness was their attempt to solve complex and ever-changing military problems with a single military theory. This led to their one-sided emphasis on offense during World War I and their one-sided emphasis on defense during World War II. Gallieni nodded slightly. It was a novel idea, and it sounded quite reasonable. Some battles required offense to win, while others required defense. Like the recently concluded Battle of Ypres, where Charles achieved victory by inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy during a defensive maneuver. Gallieni considered for a moment, then wrote on the document, adapt to local conditions and choose appropriate tactics. Charles noticed this and found it somewhat amusing. This didn't actually need to be memorized. One could simply buy a copy of The Art of War or the 36 Stratagems, which contained everything. The ancients had already explained these issues clearly and explicitly. At this time, although the European powers had achieved industrialization and possessed formidable military equipment, they were still inferior to China in terms of strategy and tactics. Gallieni put down his pen and changed the subject. I heard you're developing a new type of tank. Yes, Charles didn't deny it. There was little need to hide this from the military, especially from Gallieni, with whom Charles had some kind of agreement. Then you'd better be careful, Gallieni said. There are at least two competitors. Two? Charles assumed it was only Francis. So who was the other one? Gallieni seemed to read Charles's mind. He said, have you heard of TASS? Charles shook his head blankly. A government department, Gallieni explained. It's called the Automotive Technical Services Department. In principle, all vehicles entering the military are under this department's jurisdiction. TASS discovered that someone was bypassing them to develop tanks independently, Francis's tank. So, they partnered with Schneider to develop a larger, more powerful tank. Hearing the name Schneider, Charles understood, it was probably the key. Gallieni then added, this project is supported by General Joffre. Charles realized, therefore he was no longer under Gallieni's control. However, Gallieni added, I will try my best to include them all in the wartime procurement regulations. You know, we'll buy whichever is best. Chapter 130 I only commanded that battle. The rain continued to fall intermittently in Ypres, the fighting having come to a temporary halt. The German losses were considerable, with over 10,000 casualties in 2 days of offensive operations, while Belgian casualties were negligible. More importantly, a consensus seemed to have formed among the German troops, including General Cross. They could not defeat the enemy, despite still possessing superior numbers. Therefore, General Cross, under pressure from Chief of the General Staff Fouquingham, repeatedly refused to launch an offensive. In a telegram to Fouquingham, he stated, if the enemy maintains air superiority, our so-called offensive is merely pushing soldiers to the front lines as targets. I refuse to do so. Soon after, French reinforcements arrived, further solidifying General Cross's resolve to abandon the offensive. General Foch took over command of Ypres. Everyone expected Foch to launch an immediate attack, as the military and civilians were accustomed to his style of warfare. However, surprisingly, Foch did not do so. He deployed French troops in batches to replace the Belgian forces and established a system of rotation for frontline defense. And then nothing more happened. All troop deployments remained unchanged. The artillery was still 5 kilometers behind a defensive line, unmoved. Many, including Albert I, speculated that Charles's deployment was so perfect that any alteration Foch made would be a mistake. General Charles's analysis perhaps explained Foch's mindset at this time. General Foch is very clever. Given Charles's great success with a defensive posture, if he were to launch an attack and suffer heavy losses without making any progress, he would embarrass himself in front of everyone, and his military theories might even be abandoned. Therefore, he prefers to let others speculate, even though that speculation is equally detrimental to him. Charles didn't consider all this. He was enjoying another 2-day, 1-night vacation. Sometimes Charles wondered what would happen if his vacation suddenly arrived halfway through the war. Would he abandon the battlefield, including the 1st Air Group, to go home for a holiday? He wondered if Glenick would allow it. Fortunately, he hadn't encountered this situation yet, including the time he was tricked into going to Antwerp, where he just happened to return on the 2nd night. Charles ate breakfast at home, preferring Camille's apple tarts to the food in the officers' mess hall. More importantly, if he ate in the mess hall, Camille would force him to eat some more at home. As Charles ate his crisp, fragrant, and still warm apple tarts with milk, the neighbors thoughtfully delivered the little daily news to his door again. This time it's Ypres, Mrs. Bernard, a neighbor exclaimed. Charles has won another brilliant battle. Camille glanced at Charles, her face ashen, and rushed out to fetch the newspaper. After glancing at it, she waved it at Charles, her eyes filled with disbelief and anger. They sent you to the front again? No, mother, Charles explained, I've been in Paris the whole time. I only commanded the battle, by telephone and telegram. Camille breathed a sigh of relief. She only cared whether Charles was on the front lines. She didn't understand or need to understand anything else. Command. Djoko took the newspaper from Camille in shock, eating as he read, but stopped after a short while. He looked up at Charles, seemingly incredulous. You mean, you commanded the Battle of Ypres, part of it, Charles corrected. Which part? Djoko asked. The aircraft part. Charles hesitated, unsure if he should mention the unit designation. Also, the artillery was involved to some extent, but not much. Charles made the decisions regarding artillery direction. For example, where and when the artillery should fire. Other aspects like logistics were organized by General Gallieni. Djoko swallowed hard. He had indeed heard rumors these past few days that the French army had mounted machine guns on airplanes and won a major victory in Ypres, while the German army, despite having several times the number of troops, dared not attack rashly. Djoko had suspected Charles's involvement, and now it seemed so. I hope you didn't do this just to sell tractors, Djoko laughed. Charles nodded. It does have something to do with selling tractors. The two exchanged a smile. Everyone's attention was focused on the planes and the battlefield, or on the artillery's spectacular bombardment that killed or wounded over 10,000 enemy soldiers. Almost no one noticed that the 4 artillery regiments, totaling 152 cannons, were all hauled into the muddy Ypres by tractors. In addition, over 300 tractors shuttled between the battlefield and the train station, constantly transporting ammunition and supplies and bringing the wounded back from the front. Gallieni purchased 500 Holt 60 tractors from Charles in the first batch, and soon after, another 500, at 2,500 francs each. These 2 batches alone brought Charles back 2.5 million francs. Keep in mind that Charles bought these Holt 60 tractors from Francis for a mere 900 francs, making a profit of 1,600 francs, a veritable windfall. And that wasn't all. Charles still had 800 Holt 60s, and with the rainy season approaching, it was almost certain the military would increase its purchases, allowing them to make another fortune. Ignoring everything else, Charles had doubled his wealth from this single transaction. Camille, unaware of the tractors, asked, What tractors? Nothing, Djoko replied. We're talking about the tractor factory business. Djoko winked at Charles, intentionally letting Camille misunderstand. He believed Camille didn't need to know anything about Francis. In his villa, Francis sat alone on the sofa, puffing on his pipe, his face darker than the burning tobacco. He realized he might have been deceived. He'd heard the military had purchased a large number of Hort 60s for the battlefield, but he hadn't received any orders from the military. The only reasonable explanation, the Hort 60s the military received were the ones he'd recently sold to Vartan, his inventory. An Algerian nobleman? Shipped to Algeria for planting? It's all a lie. He clearly sold it to the military for a huge profit. And why didn't Gravy and Armand, these people in Parliament, receive any warning or clue? Could it be that they were behind it all? Francis suddenly felt isolated. He felt everyone was betraying him, and he was the only one kept in the dark. Chapter 131 The rival is not just Charles. Simon entered and spoke to Francis. Francis's eyelids twitched, and he gritted his teeth, saying, Is this true? Yes, Simon nodded in reply. The military's Hort 60 tractors are all purchased from the Charles Tractor Factory, currently numbering 1,000, at 2,500 francs each. Francis remained silent. He appeared calm on the surface, but his heart was bleeding. He didn't even have the courage to calculate his losses. "Sir," Simon suggested, "we still have a chance. If the military has such a large demand, we can bring back the workers to produce them. We can produce 500 tractors per month." Francis gently shook his head. Simon might be a good steward, but he was certainly not a good businessman. "The military's demand has been almost completely met by this batch of tractors," Francis said helplessly. "Next, our competitor is still the Charles Hort 75. Which tractor do you think the military would choose if presented with both?" Simon was speechless. Even a fool would know to choose the more powerful and faster Hort 75. In other words, Francis had been completely kicked out of the tractor industry by Charles. It's hard to imagine that Francis, a shrewd and cautious businessman known as a commercial genius, who had built such a large factory over decades, could be defeated so utterly by a young man who had only been in business for a little over a month and started from scratch. It seems that all Francis can do is sell off the factory's redundant buildings and production lines, keeping only a small portion dedicated to tank production. The embarrassing thing is, who would be willing to buy the outdated Hort 60 production line? It seems only the Charles Tractor Factory would be willing to pay, as they could upgrade part of the production line to Hort 75 line. If Francis wants to sell it, he has to go to Charles, otherwise, he'll have to throw the production line away like garbage. Francis seems to have realized this as well. He snorted, his face growing increasingly grim. How much would Charles pay for the production line? 50,000 francs? Even less. Francis planned to discuss it with Gravy and Armand first. Maybe they would buy it, or they knew someone willing to buy it, who knows? This was Francis's only consolation. His aristocratic friends hadn't abandoned him. However, as Francis's car was about to leave the factory, it was stopped by several French soldiers. Simon, driving ahead, turned around and explained, "They came to Bougain early this morning, saying it was to protect the safety of tank production." "Sir, your identification." A lieutenant stood expressionlessly in front of the car. After looking at the identification Francis handed him, he turned his gaze to the file bag beside his seat and asked, "What's that?" "You don't need to know," Francis replied impatiently. It contained the blueprints for the new tank he planned to take to discuss improvement plans with Gravy and the others. "It is necessary, sir." The lieutenant's voice was cold. "Our mission here, besides protecting your safety, is also to protect state secrets." Francis had no choice but to hand the file bag to the lieutenant. The lieutenant opened the document, glanced at it, and immediately became alert. He fixed his gaze on Francis and asked, "This is tank blueprints?" Francis answered truthfully, "I'm planning to improve it." "I'm sorry, sir." The lieutenant handed the blueprints back to Francis. "You can't take it out. If you absolutely must, you need to file a report beforehand, detailing the contents of the document, its destination, and its purpose. We will send someone with you." Francis, who was already in a bad mood, instantly flew into a rage. He roared, "Lieutenant, I'm just producing tanks to sell to you. You have no right to interfere with my freedom." Before he could finish speaking, the last few words faded and disappeared, because the lieutenant had straightened up, his hand on the gun case at his waist, and the guards in front of the vehicle had also taken their rifles from their shoulders. The lieutenant's voice turned stern, carrying a hint of command. "I'm sorry, sir. You did indeed only sell us tanks, but we paid for them and risked our lives on the battlefield. If the enemy learns of the tank's weaknesses, our soldiers will die in droves. Do you still insist this is your prerogative?" By the end, a hint of murderous intent flashed in the lieutenant's eyes. Reluctantly, Francis could only instruct the butler to turn the car back and leave the tank blueprints at the villa. This time, the lieutenant added a body search, saying, "I have reason to suspect you're carrying the blueprints, sir." After all, it's just a piece of paper. Francis gritted his teeth, remaining silent. He knew there was no point in arguing with these guards. Upon arriving at Brad Manor, Francis's first words were, "Could you please remove the guards at my gate? They're as annoying as flies. They almost killed me over a blueprint." Armand, unaware of this, asked, "What guards?" Gravy, who had been to Charles's factory and knew some things, sat down by the fireplace, elegantly warming his hands in the firelight, and calmly asked, "Whose guards do you think they are?" "Whose?" Francis didn't understand. "Weren't they sent by the government? They're Glieri's confidants." Francis, Gravy laughed. "They're there to protect Charles." Francis suddenly realized. Charles, it was all Charles again. Then he thought about how Pierre's military service had clearly been arranged, so why the sudden problem? Obviously, it was Charles again. Francis felt fooled. He even wanted to confront Charles immediately. But Greville seemed completely unconcerned. He removed his white gloves and tossed them onto the coffee table beside him, stood up, walked to the fireplace, and stared thoughtfully at the flames. "We're in trouble, gentlemen," he said. "Our competitor isn't just Charles." Francis looked at Greville with suspicion. He couldn't believe anyone other than Charles could produce tanks. Greville then provided the answer: Schneider Electric, gentlemen. They've got the support of Joffre and the Automotive Technical Services Department, and they're developing a new type of tank. Everyone was astonished. Schneider Electric was a long-established French military-industrial enterprise producing artillery and warships. It had capital, strength, and technology. Joffre was the commander-in-chief of France. The Automotive Technical Services Department was the government department responsible for managing military vehicles. Combined, it seemed no one could rival them. Chapter 132. My tank is not participating in the bidding. The image above shows the CA-1 tank, developed by Stignac, the father of French armor, who was an artillery colonel. De Jocko had also heard about Tess's tank development, as it was a publicly announced government project. Therefore, when he and Charles saw the nearly completed Mark I tank at the tractor factory's R&D department, he asked with some concern, "Have you heard about another new tank under development?" "Yes, father," Charles replied. "I heard it was initiated by the Automotive Technical Services Department." Charles was examining the Mark I tank as he spoke, considering how infantry should coordinate with its attacks. "I heard their tanks are all equipped with cannons," De Jocko suggested again. "Should we consider that too?" "No," Charles refused decisively. Charles knew this was a mistake. Just as novices often want to learn everything they see, people of this era hope to create tanks as mobile fortresses capable of anything and able to withstand all firepower. The engine's horsepower and weight capacity, the roles of tanks and infantry, these details must be clearly defined, otherwise the battlefield will teach it a harsh lesson, even if it's a joint production of the three giants, Chaffee, the Automotive Technical Services Department, and Schneider Electric. What others might consider unsurpassable, Charles de Gaulle viewed as rubbish. The Automotive Technical Services Department spearheaded the development of the Saint-Chamond tank, while the Francis tractor plant developed the CA-1. The former suffered a crushing defeat in its first battle. A small shell crater was enough to trap it, rendering it immobile. Of the 16 tanks produced in combat, 15 broke down, after which it could only be used as mobile artillery in the rear. Tanks, meant to shield infantry from bullets, were relegated to the rear as artillery platforms, rendering their armor completely meaningless. It would have been better to simply use a cannon. Its continued existence in the army was solely due to the powerful backing of the three giants, ultimately relegated to transport vehicles, a transport vehicle prone to breakdowns and as slow as an ox. As for the CA-1, 57% of it was destroyed by enemy fire in its first battle, directly instilling a psychological trauma in French soldiers. After the war, its artillery was immediately removed and it was converted into an assault vehicle. In short, all the equipment these so-called tanks were initially equipped with in excess was completely removed after actual combat. Charles didn't think he needed to worry about competition from these junk vehicles. Joseph, wiping his hands with a rag, approached and said, "Young Master Charles, we can test drive it in 2 days. Shouldn't we carefully consider mass production?" Joseph seemed to lack confidence in the Mark I. "No." Charles's tone left no room for doubt. "After successful testing, we must immediately begin mass production." Time waits for no one. For Charles, time was not just money, but also opportunity. He needed to learn from the production and combat experience of the Mark I and accumulate talent to prepare for the later Renault tanks. "Young Master Charles," Joseph wanted to say something, but was stopped by Jocko's gaze. At this moment, Charles was like a stubborn tyrant, refusing to listen to any advice, no matter what others said or how they tried to persuade him. "He knows what he's doing," Jocko said. Though Jocko said this aloud, he thought to himself, he recently made over 2 million francs on a deal. He can afford to lose it. Let him do whatever he wants. The sun set behind the plane trees, the slanting rays filtering through the branches and casting a golden light on the fallen leaves, like a golden tablecloth spread out. Charles and Jocko had been busy at the factory all day and were just getting out of their car. As soon as they stepped outside, they saw a carriage parked there, 2 white horses and a black carriage, simple yet understatedly luxurious, Grevy's style. Joka glanced around worriedly, but seeing Laurent and his guard standing guard on both sides of the road as if facing a formidable enemy, some guards clutching their rifles, he felt somewhat relieved. Grevy, sitting in the carriage, saw Charles's car emerge through the window, opened the door, and jumped out. He stretched his limbs easily and waved to Charles with a smile. "Won't we talk?" Grevy asked confidently. Joka parked the carriage next to Grevy, but Charles showed no intention of getting out. "I don't think we have anything to talk about, Mr. Grevy," Charles replied. "We should be allies." "Charles, I know what you did," Charles interrupted Grevy. Although he had no evidence, Charles knew that Grevy was behind the previous entrapment in Antwerp. It was indeed a scheme that a thinker like Grevy could devise. Grevy understood what Charles meant and readily admitted, "That was based on our respective positions, Charles." "Things are different now." "Nothing's different," Charles answered decisively and firmly. A flicker of doubt crossed Grevy's eyes. "You must have heard about Schneider's development of a new tank." Charles nodded expressionlessly. "So," Grevy asked, "don't you think only we can deal with him by joining forces?" "That's Schneider, and there's also Chaffee and the Automotive Technical Service Department." When Grevy heard about this, he didn't see it as a trouble, he even thought it was an opportunity, a rare opportunity. Only with a powerful enemy like Schneider could Charles be forced to his side. Charles was a smart man, he knew what to do. God, joining forces with Charles, just thinking about it was exciting. But as it turned out, Grevy was overthinking it. "This has nothing to do with me, Mr. Grevy," Charles replied calmly. "What do you mean?" Grevy spread his hands. "My tank isn't participating in the bidding," Charles answered expressionlessly. "I'm just building it for fun, so that's between you and Schneider." Grevy stared at Charles in surprise. Joka, sitting in the driver's seat, turned his head. He didn't know that the tank wasn't participating in the bidding, and then he assumed that Charles was lying, trying to make Grevy and Schneider fight each other. The car gradually drove away, leaving Grevy standing there dumbfounded. Grevy had considered many possibilities before coming here, but he never expected this outcome. Not participating in the bidding? Then what was the point of spending money building tanks? Just for fun? Grevy certainly wouldn't take that seriously. That meant sitting back and watching the Titans fight. That was also unlikely, because the winner would ultimately receive the order, and since Charles didn't participate, it wouldn't get the order, meaning it would be eliminated from the start. That meant... A flicker of fear suddenly flashed in Grevy's eyes. There was another possibility. Charles simply didn't take his and Schneider's tanks seriously. The image above shows the Saint Salmon tank. Its more advanced feature is its electric motor drive. Chapter 133 Hand Grenade. After the family had dinner by candlelight, Joka, while Camille was washing the dishes in the kitchen, advised Charles. "I don't object to your insistence on the tank, Charles," Joka said, with a hint of anxiety. "I don't even object to your non-competition, but you seem to need allies. You can't fight the whole world alone, even if you're excellent," he added. "The methods the enemy can use are likely beyond your imagination, they are unpredictable, and sometimes you have to choose sides." "I understand, Father." Charles picked up a plum from his plate and popped it into his mouth. Camille said plums were almost out of season and they should catch them before they had to wait until next year. And, Joka hesitated, "Sometimes we shouldn't dwell on the past, but look at the present and the future." Joka was referring to Charles being tricked into going to Antwerp. Grevy had indeed tried to harm Charles, but alliances and betrayals were common in business, and he believed that it was advantageous to ally with the Grevy now. More importantly, Joka knew that the Grevy nobles were adept at power struggles and in fighting. It was ingrained in their blood. If they allied with them, they wouldn't have to worry about an accident like last time. It was a fear-based identification, similar to Stockholm Syndrome. "I won't ally with Grevy," Charles said without hesitation. "They will eventually be eliminated by the Times. Allying with them is not a wise choice." "Then, who else can we ally with?" Joka countered. An alliance with Schneider was clearly impossible. The animosity between Joffre and Gallieni was well known. Choosing Gallieni meant choosing Joffre. Furthermore, an arms giant like Schneider wouldn't take Charles seriously. An alliance with them would only bring humiliation. Charles hesitated for a moment, then calmly said, "Don't worry, Father, I'll have allies come to me." "What?" Joka didn't understand Charles's meaning. "You'll understand, Father." Charles stood up, ending the conversation, and casually grabbed a few plums. He found the taste quite good, but he hadn't considered it before. Sometimes, it's better to broaden the options. Back in his room, Charles took out paper, pen, and ruler and sketched a draft. A wooden handle grenade, the principle was simple, even handmade, different explosive charges could classify it as offensive or defensive. He finished the drawing quickly, though it wasn't perfect, but precision wasn't necessary. He then added a page of text with simple annotations, made a copy for himself, clipped them together, and went downstairs to hand it to Joka, who was still sitting at the dining table in a daze. "Father, take this to register industrial property tomorrow." Joka took the document, flipped through it, hesitated, but ultimately nodded without saying a word. Charles understood Joka's meaning. "What we lack isn't industrial property, Charles, nor is it money. We have plenty of money now. But some things money can't buy." Charles didn't explain further, he would understand in time. The next day, Paris enjoyed a rare sunny day. The sky was a clear blue, and the sun tore through the clouds, casting long shadows on the speeding cars. "Can you believe it, Lieutenant?" Laurent said. "It's pouring rain in Ypres right now." "Oh?" Charles asked curiously. "You received intelligence from Ypres?" "Of course," Laurent nodded. "The general wants you to know every detail of the battlefield on your way back. But for now, everything is normal. Nothing has happened." Charles suddenly understood. This was Guerrieri's method for handling Charles's vacation. Battlefield intelligence would continuously reach Laurent, and if any special circumstances required Charles's attention, it would be immediately delivered to him. A very good approach. There shouldn't be anything major happening in Ypres recently. With the air superiority issue unresolved, the German offensive would undoubtedly be thwarted by the French 75mm guns. And the Germans, on the one hand, had the advantage of hilly terrain, while the French army, situated on a flat and muddy plain, would be practically committing suicide if they launched a counterattack. Charles realized he seemed to have saved many people. In history, this battle saw the German and French armies push and shove. Each suffered over 100,000 casualties on the Ypres plain, 130,000 German casualties and 100,000 Allied casualties. Now, however, it ended with only a little over 10,000 casualties. The ending was the same, but the casualties were more than 200,000 fewer. Using war to stop war, killing to save lives, isn't that ironic? Perhaps because the battlefield was basically stable, the headquarters was not as busy as usual. Gallieni sat at his desk, munching on bread while staring at a map, his mind already on the front lines. This was a habit he had maintained for many years. He almost never ate in the mess hall, even though it was downstairs. "General," Charles handed him a backup sketch of a grenade, saying, "I think we need this equipment." Gallieni glanced at the sketch but didn't pay it any mind, his gaze immediately returning to the map. He asked, "What is this?" "A grenade," Charles replied, "an explosive to replace the grenadier's throws." Gallieni looked up with an O, his face immediately showing seriousness. He soon tossed the bread aside, taking out a diagram in one hand and a written instruction manual in the other. After studying them for a while, he waved the document in his hand, asking Charles with a hint of doubt, "You mean, it doesn't need ignition, just a pull of the pin to detonate?" "Yes, General," Charles replied, "a few seconds delay, to give the soldiers time to throw it." Gallieni immediately understood the importance of this thing, nodding firmly, "You're right, Lieutenant. We definitely need this." "Do you have a sample?" "No, General," Charles replied, "I just designed it and am registering industrial property rights. I was thinking that if the army needs it, I can put it into production immediately." "It's not difficult." "Yes, we need it." Gallieni nodded repeatedly. "Of course we need it." Gallieni was a combat-oriented general who would frequently send staff officers to the front lines to understand the actual situation, believing this ensured that command was not divorced from reality. Therefore, he knew that at this moment, the soldiers on the front lines were digging out explosives from the Grenadier era and throwing them at the enemy in the trenches. But explosives had many drawbacks, such as being susceptible to moisture and requiring ignition. Charles had actually designed a grenade specifically for throwing, requiring no ignition and easy to throw. It was practically designed for trench warfare. "We need at least 10,000, General Guerrieri nodded confidently. Charles couldn't help but laugh. 10,000? A million-strong army on the French front, even if each soldier had 5, would require 5 or 6 million grenades. 10 million wouldn't be enough, and that didn't even account for subsequent consumption. The image above shows a simple grenade made from canned goods by the Allied powers in the early stages of World War I. The German army already had rudimentary grenade prototypes, such as spring-loaded or pull-action ball grenades, but the Allies were initially in the process of making their own grenades, only urgently producing and supplying them to the front lines more than a month later. Chapter 134 Saint-Étienne Arsenal. In Paris's 16th arrondissement, Steed and Bonnet, owner of the tabloid Le Petit Journal, strolled on a golf course, flanked by caddies carrying clubs and equipment. Steed and Bonnet belonged to the Republican Party, a sub-republic of the Republicans. This is somewhat convoluted. Republic of the Republicans is a collective term for all left-wing parties, and Republic refers to the Third Republic. Within the left wing, there is a party named Republic of the Republicans, which literally means republic. Steed was the leader of the Republican Party, intentionally choosing this name to mislead people into believing it represented the powerful entire left wing, thus ensuring the Republican Party's continued victories and celebrations. However, this still couldn't prevent the Republican Party from being gradually marginalized within the left wing. Creativity. Bonnet, we need creativity. Golf is a leisurely sport, but Steed, already in his 60s, couldn't relax at all. They've already kicked our machine guns out of the army, and now they're trying to use the same methods on rifles. At this rate, we'll have nothing left. Bonnet nodded obsequiously. He knew Steed was referring to the French government's plan to replace the Lebel rifle with a Berthier rifle. The Berthier rifle was actually an evolution of the Lebel rifle, initially a cavalry rifle with a shorter barrel and a vertical magazine instead of a tubular magazine, using a 3-round clip for loading. These modifications were made for the convenience of cavalry, and the French army even gave it to the colonial army as second-rate equipment. Unexpectedly, this rifle became very popular. Soldiers reported that the Berthier rifle was much better than the Lebel, and easier and cheaper to manufacture. The result of parliamentary discussions was to stop production of the Lebel rifle, optimize and improve the Berthier rifle to suit infantry use, and eventually replace the Lebel. The key point is that the task of improvement was assigned to Remington Armory in the United States, not Saint-Étienne. The Saint-Étienne Armory only handles small arms. Machine guns are already out of the question. If rifles are also out, what will Saint-Étienne have left? Almost nothing but decorative revolvers? Steed found a golf ball on the grass. He took the club from the caddy, stood beside it, and swung with a standard, natural posture. The golf ball bounced a few times on the grass, slowed down, and then fell precisely into the hole a dozen meters away. But Steed showed no joy. Instead, he sighed deeply at the hole. In this era of rising machinery, a small idea can revive a company, just one. However, Steed helplessly discovered that he had no ideas whatsoever. His mind was like a well that had dried up for many years. No matter how hard he tried, not a single drop of water could be squeezed out. He seemed only able to watch helplessly as the industry he had built gradually withered away, like the sycamore trees by the roadside. One morning, he opened his eyes, drew back the curtains, and suddenly found that all their once lush leaves had fallen to the ground, leaving only bare branches. Steed gazed at the lake beside the grass, unconsciously thinking of the man he envied to the point of madness. Rumor had it he had another new invention. He'd successfully brought a machine gun onto an airplane and won. Lucky guy, Steed murmured to himself. God gave him the best gift. Bonnet, standing beside him, didn't know what to say. He knew this was how it was when playing with Steed. Steed didn't need anyone else, just someone to listen to him. Just then, an attendant came running towards them like the wind. Bonnet immediately tensed. He knew there was breaking news again. Sure enough, the attendant ran up, panting, and said, "Sir, Charles has a new invention, and his father is registering industrial property rights." Steed turned sharply at this, his previously stagnant eyes instantly brightening. "What is it? What has he invented?" "It's something called a hand grenade," the attendant explained. "The details aren't clear yet, but from the description, it seems to be a hand-thrown light weapon, intended to replace hand-thrown explosives." Steed's breathing quickened, his eyes gleaming with greed. He suddenly threw down his golf club and strode towards the exit, his pace accelerating until it became a jog, shouting anxiously, "Bring the car over. We need to get to City Hall right now." Bonnet chased after him from behind. "Mr. Steed, we can take it slow. I'll have someone keep him calm." Steed had a heart condition. He couldn't handle strenuous exercise or stimulation, and Bonnet didn't want anything to happen to him at this moment. But Steed completely disregarded Bonnet's words, saying as he walked, "We can't miss this opportunity. It might be our only chance." Our only chance. Last time, the tank industrial rights weren't successfully acquired, perhaps due to hesitation about its inappropriateness, as it involved heavy equipment with high technological content like engines. But now, the hand grenade was a genuine light weapon, low in technology and easy to produce. It was absolutely perfect for the St. Etienne Armory. It was St. Etienne's hope. In the City Hall VIP room, Joka, applying for industrial rights, filled out the form with doubt. He didn't understand Charles's purpose in inventing this little gadget. Was it profitable? Tractor factories, motorcycle factories, and even aircraft manufacturing plants, any one of them would be more profitable than this thing called a hand grenade. It was even a dangerous item, a bomb that needed to be loaded with gunpowder, so a separate factory needed to be set up in an open area, otherwise it could potentially affect the surrounding area. Producing it would definitely require a large initial investment, and the potential profits were not optimistic. Just as his interest waned, a dozen cars pulled up one after another in front of the city hall. A moment later, an elderly man, leaning on a cane and panting heavily, hurriedly appeared at the VIP room door. He looked at the government official, Manuel, with a questioning gaze. Manuel nodded slightly, indicating he'd made it. The industrial property hadn't been sold. A hint of confusion lingered in his eyes, as if to say, no one else would be interested in this little thing. There's no need to rush. Joka also noticed the old man standing at the door, then exclaimed and stood up. Mr. Steed, the owner of the St. Etienne arsenal, who practically monopolized the production of all the army's light weapons, was a well-known figure in France. Steed breathed a sigh of relief. He slowly stepped forward, tossed aside his cane, and shook hands with Joka, a hint of relief in his voice. Mr. Joka, let's talk about the ownership of the grenade industry. If you can cooperate with us, that would be wonderful. Joka was utterly shocked. He suddenly understood what Charles meant by those words, I will have my allies come to me. He also understood why Charles had designed this little grenade at this time. The image above shows the St. Etienne arsenal, which employed 10,000 workers and produced 30,000 weapons annually in peacetime. During World War I, it expanded to over 16,000 workers, doubling its output. The St. Etienne arsenal showed signs of decline before World War I, but the demand for munitions during the two world wars kept it afloat. It then declined further in the 1970s and finally closed in 2001. Chapter 135 Long Lost Brothers. The negotiations went smoothly. Steed glanced at the sketches and instructions and immediately offered two options with a beaming smile: 1 million francs for the industrial property rights, or choose to cooperate, and I will give you 50% of the profits. Joka was stunned by such generous terms. He hadn't expected this seemingly insignificant thing to be worth 1 million francs. Tank industrial property rights had only sold for 990,000 francs. It was worth more than that massive tank. Seeing Joka's stunned expression, Steed added, this is the initial offer, Mr. Joka. If you are not satisfied, we can discuss it further. Joka was a little dizzy. This was only the initial offer? Bonnet, standing beside him, was also puzzled. Business negotiations shouldn't be conducted this way. Steed was an expert in this area. Why was he unusually revealing his hand today, all for this seemingly insignificant little gadget? Little did Bonnet know that Steed wasn't just after the value of the grenade. He hoped to establish a connection with Charles through this connection. He silently repeated to himself, choose cooperation, please. It will create far more wealth than selling the property rights. If it were up to Joka, he would have sold the industrial property rights without hesitation. But he knew Charles's goal was to ally with Steed, so he nodded and replied, no, Mr. Steed, we don't need to discuss the price, because I choose cooperative production. Fantastic. Steed laughed heartily, even excitedly hugging Joka. A wise choice, Mr. Joka. If there's an opportunity, I'd be happy to invite you and Charles to visit my arsenal. You could even participate in its management. We're partners, right? We're partners. Steed then patted Joka's shoulder affectionately, as if Joka were a long-lost brother he had finally found. This was exactly the outcome Charles had hoped for. Charles had long considered forming an alliance. His individual power was too weak, and the restrictions of the military regulations prevented him from cultivating his own power base. An alliance was the only way out. He mentally reviewed the capitalists he knew. The right wing was out of the question. They opposed industrialization, which contradicted his own inventive mind, and would ultimately lead to conflict due to differing development directions. The steel monopoly and the Wendell family? They seemed to be on completely different levels. The Brest shipyard? With Britain as an ally at sea, France had little need for warships and was virtually immune to crisis. That left only Schneider, who manufactured artillery, and Saint Etienne, who made small arms. Schneider was stronger and originally had great potential. Charles could work on tank guns, and helping Schneider develop armor-piercing weapons in the future wasn't out of the question. However, before Charles could even act, Schneider suddenly became his competitor. That left only Steed of Saint Etienne. Then Charles suddenly realized that this was like opening a treasure trove for him. Many small arms were lined up waiting for him to invent. These small arms didn't have high technical barriers, and Charles could produce them himself. However, since it involved gunpowder, building it from scratch would be very troublesome, so outsourcing production to the Saint Etienne arsenal was clearly a good option. And coincidentally, Steed's Saint Etienne arsenal was in dire straits. That was it. Just a little invention to spur it on, and it would swarm like flies, up like bees, definitely like bees. Therefore, when de Jocko sent word that he had chosen to cooperate with Saint Etienne, Charles wasn't surprised at all. Everything was going as he hoped. As dusk fell and the street lights came on, normally at this time, the command post would be busy organizing documents and intelligence under the lights, perhaps even working through the night, since the battlefield waits for no one. But now the frontline fighting was at a stalemate with nothing major happening, so only a few staff officers remained on duty, and the rest were dismissed to rest. Charles was about to return to his quarters when Lieutenant Colonel Fernand stopped him. "Hey, Lieutenant, aren't you going to rest?" Lieutenant Colonel Fernand asked. Charles glanced at the open dormitory door, puzzled. Wasn't he just about to rest? Lieutenant Colonel Fernand smiled and invited him on. "Come on, it's time to relax." Charles only realized upon arriving at their destination that Lieutenant Colonel Fernand's relaxation referred to the officers' club. He was quite disappointed. Could this really be called relaxation? The club was dimly lit and filled with smoke. On the stage, a piano played intermittently the recently popular jazz music. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand ordered a small glass of green absinthe for each of them, generously spreading his hands and saying, "Order as much as you want, it's on me tonight." Charles knew this required courage. Absinthe was expensive and not easily obtained. Many countries had banned its sale due to its hallucinogenic properties. Although France hadn't banned it yet, due to numerous restrictions on production, it was becoming increasingly rare, and the price remained high. It was said that only the wealthy could afford to store a whole bottle. Note, absinthe was banned in France in 1915. Charles thought that Lieutenant Colonel Fernand must know he couldn't drink much, which was why he was being so generous. This was Charles's first time drinking alcohol. Looking at the green liquid in his glass, he naturally assumed it was a slightly sweet drink. He took a small sip without warning and was suddenly choked, coughing involuntarily. Laughter came from several officers nearby, who seemed to be wondering where this newbie came from. Behind the bar, a sweet-looking female bartender skillfully wielded the cocktail shaker, glancing at Charles with interest before turning her gaze to Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. "Lieutenant Colonel, your new orderly." "Who?" "Him." Lieutenant Colonel Fernand realized that the orderly the bartender was referring to was Charles and quickly shook his head to explain. No, you've misunderstood. Lucia, I'm his orderly." The bartender, called Lucia, laughed along, thinking Lieutenant Colonel Fernand was joking. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand leaned close to Charles's ear and said, "You'll get used to it, Lieutenant. Relaxing here after a long day is a good option. It'll help you get a good night's sleep." He raised his glass and gestured towards Charles. "You're welcome. It's what I should do." Charles, panting, finally caught his breath. He thought that Lieutenant Colonel Fernand might have forgotten two things. First, Charles was still a minor and not in a suitable position to drink. Second, Charles had one day off every 2 days. So Lieutenant Colonel Fernand's suggestion of relaxing here after a long day was meaningless. If necessary, Charles could sleep all day at home. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Why not use tanks to break through in chapter 136? Charles felt dizzy after only 2 small glasses. He later learned that absinthe's alcohol content was completely mismatched with its pure and lovely color. The low-proof stuff ranged from 45% to a staggering 89.9%. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand had given Charles 50%, No wonder he was so generous in treating him. Just as Charles was feeling lightheaded, someone in the club suddenly started shouting. Looking in the direction of the sound, he saw a slightly overweight officer being teased by other officers. Whether it was due to the alcohol or the dim lighting, Charles couldn't see his rank. The others were passing a letter around, while the overweight officer anxiously chased after it, shouting angrily. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand just smiled and continued drinking. Such things were common in the army. Officers and soldiers often snatched each other's letters to read aloud to relieve boredom, and over time it became a habit. Just then, a quick-handed person snatched the letter, nimbly leaping onto the sofa to retrieve it and read aloud, "My dearest Lucia." Another commotion erupted within the club. It turned out to be a love letter to the bartender, and an officer even called out to her, "Hey, Lucia, how many is this now?" Lucia simply smiled slightly, pouring her mixed drink from the jug into a glass, her emotions completely unaffected. She seemed quite used to such things. The fat officer looked embarrassed, completely flustered by the teasing from the other officers. Just as they were about to continue reading the letter, Charles couldn't help but say, "Enough. Give the letter back to him." The officers were taken aback, then burst into laughter, shouting all at once, "Mind your own business, Lieutenant, this is none of your business." Someone even yelled at Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, "Lieutenant Colonel, shouldn't you be managing your men?" Lieutenant Colonel Fernand's face darkened, and he replied, "Did you all hear that? Give the letter back to him." The officers were stunned, all looking at them in confusion. Some of them knew Lieutenant Colonel Fernand and even had a relationship with him, as they were frequent drinkers here. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand showed no mercy. He coldly asked, "If this isn't Charles's turn to speak, then I'd like to ask who is? Step forward and let me see." The club suddenly fell silent, all eyes turning to Charles. Lucia also looked at Charles in shock, only then realizing that what Lieutenant Colonel Fernand had said earlier might be true. The officers murmured amongst themselves for a moment, then returned the letter to the portly officer. Several others gave Charles a perfunctory salute. "We're very sorry, Lieutenant, we didn't know it was you. I apologize for my rudeness." The portly officer hurriedly took back the letter, glanced quickly at Lucia, nodded to Charles in thanks, and fled the club as if escaping. Charles felt somewhat bored, or rather, that he had spoiled the other officers' enjoyment, so he gestured to Lieutenant Colonel Fernand to pay for the meal and return home. After that, Charles almost forgot about the incident and rarely went to the officers' club. He couldn't find the same relaxation in that environment as Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. However, he was right about one thing: he slept very well after drinking, drifting off to sleep until dawn, though his head ached a little. In mid-October in Paris, the weather showed signs of the approaching rainy season. A strong wind howled outside the window, the sky was overcast, and soon a heavy rain began amidst thunder and lightning. The work in the operations office continued, with Charles tracking every point on the defensive line based on telegrams from the front. When Charles roughly outlined the current positions, Galini sighed and shook his head slightly. "It seems the same as yesterday, almost no movement, not an inch." "Perhaps we can't hope for a breakthrough," Charles said. "What do you mean?" Galini asked, puzzled. Charles looked at the map and said, "A stalemate might be the norm. We must prepare for this to continue for a long time. Historically, this defensive line wouldn't change much in the next 4 years. It shifted back and forth like a tug-of-war between the enemy and ourselves. If anything changed, it was the ever-increasing casualty figures." Galini didn't know this. He always believed the stalemate was temporary. He considered for a moment, then asked thoughtfully, "Why don't we consider breaking through with tanks?" He bent down and searched the map for a while, then pointed to a point and said, "I think this is suitable. What do you think?" Charles was the inventor of the tank and also the first commander to win a battle with tanks. Galini felt it necessary to seek his opinion. Charles glanced at the point Galini had pointed out and agreed, "Lofwix is a good choice, flat terrain, convenient for resupply, and connected by roads suitable for tank mobility." Galini traced a small circle along the defensive line with his finger. "Even if we can't break through the enemy's lines, leveling this salient is imperative. The terrain here isn't suitable for our defense. The German-occupied high ground puts us at a disadvantage." Then, as if remembering something, Galini looked up at Charles and said, "By the way, provide me with information on the tanks under development immediately. I need to include them in the wartime procurement regulations. The bidding process will begin in a few days." Charles hesitated for a moment before replying, "Sorry, General. I'm not participating in the bidding." Galini was taken aback. You're not participating in the bidding? What happened? Then Gallieni understood. They pressured you, didn't they? Those bastards. No, General, Charles quickly clarified. No one pressured me. I withdrew voluntarily. Gallieni glanced at Charles sideways, seemingly waiting for him to tell the truth. Sighing, Charles could only fabricate a lie. I've realized we're far behind. Competing is pointless except for humiliation, so I plan to focus all my energy on the next tier of tanks. The truth? Gallieni asked, his eyes still fixed on Charles. Charles could only shake his head. He could fool others, but not Gallieni. Besides, the Mark I was about to enter mass production, contradicting his abandonment, Gallieni would eventually find out the truth. But these things couldn't be discussed in the office. Charles glanced towards the lounge. Gallieni understood, picked up a cup of coffee, and went into the lounge. I can't beat the competition. Charles revealed the truth. My tanks are far behind in terms of specifications, but I predict they'll likely suffer a crushing defeat on the battlefield. So, Gallieni interrupted Charles, his tone filled with anger. So, you're just waiting for them to fail on the battlefield before launching your tank? And ignoring the soldiers who are about to lose their lives on the battlefield. Chapter 137. I'd rather not know the truth. What else can I do, General? Charles retorted. I don't want my tanks to lose either, but the fact is, they have no hope of winning. Gallieni was taken aback, then realized it wasn't Charles's fault. It wasn't something he could control. However, Gallieni still felt he couldn't stand idly by. You can try your best to stop it. How? Charles asked softly, then added, if they believed me, there wouldn't have been those other 2 tanks. They produced those 2 tanks to defeat me, and you're trying to make them believe me and abandon those 2 tanks. Gallieni was speechless. Charles was telling the truth. Trying to make an opponent give up research and competition with just words was impossible. That would only be seen as having ulterior motives and be ridiculed. He paced back and forth in the room, frowning, then suddenly stopped and said, tell me about their tank problems, and I'll put pressure on them. Charles shook his head. It's useless, General. They already consider you one of my men. What you say is just as malicious in their eyes. We must try, Gallieni insisted. This concerns the outcome of a battle, and the incalculable casualties of our soldiers. Charles could only reply, I don't know their tank data. I have no way of knowing their specific weaknesses. This wasn't true. Charles knew the enemy's tank weaknesses without looking at the data, but that was future data, and Charles couldn't say it. Say what you know, Gallieni interrupted Charles. Artillery, General, Charles replied. Mounting artillery onto a tank isn't as easy as it seems. Weight, accuracy, exhaust fumes, all the problems remain unsolved, creating a series of fatal weaknesses. Decades later, during World War II, Germany's Panzer I tank still only had 2 machine guns. A 100-horsepower engine only dared to accommodate 2 machine guns and 2 crew members, weighing a total of 5.4 tons. Meanwhile, the Saint-Chamond tank, with only a 90-horsepower engine, dared to cram in a 75mm cannon and 4 machine guns, requiring 9 crew members to operate, with a combat weight reaching a staggering 27 tons. Gallieni thought about it and agreed. If mounting artillery onto a tank were so easy, why didn't Charles do it? Was Charles foolish? Then he seemed to understand the problem. Everyone else was taking too big a step, pursuing superficial data and powerful armament while neglecting overall performance. Charles's tank, though lacking in artillery, was precisely the rational, correct, and combat-ready design. This was undeniable. Charles knew it, as evidenced by his many brilliant victories on the battlefield. Gallieni sighed softly and sat back down in his chair. He understood Charles's predicament. This was the greed of capitalists. They would stop at nothing for profit and wealth, and no one could stop them. But tragically, the soldiers fighting on the front lines were the ones who had to pay the price. When it came to the bidding process, the situation left Gallieni speechless. He saw the specifications of 2 tanks, Saint-Chamond. 90 horsepower, 1 long-barreled 75mm cannon, 4 machine guns, 9 crew members, combat weight 27 tons, top speed 8.5 km per hour. CA1. 61 horsepower, 1 short-barreled 75mm cannon, 2 machine guns, 6 crew members, combat weight 14 tons, top speed 5 km per hour. If Charles hadn't reminded him, Gallieni would have shared the desire for as many tanks as possible with the best weapons, but now he knew there was definitely a problem. However, everyone seemed to be in a frenzy. Even the soldiers participating in the testing believed that such tanks were needed, that they could protect them and bring victory. The members of the House of Representatives were in an uproar, neither side willing to back down, attacking each other and presenting every statistic for comparison and analysis. The final result was an order for 400 of each of the two tank types, at a unit price of 21,000 francs and 12,000 francs respectively. Gallieni, unusually, remained silent throughout. He knew it was unchangeable. He only exclaimed inwardly, "My God, that's over 13 million francs. To spend so much money on a bunch of machines that will defeat the army and kill soldiers, it's insane." However, he could only watch helplessly as it unfolded. At that moment, Gallieni even wished Charles hadn't told him the truth. In stark contrast to Gallieni's dejection, cheers erupted at the Bled estate. Glasses filled with golden champagne clinked together joyfully. Armand excitedly raised his glass and shouted, "To Colonel Estini!" And his tanks, the others joined in, chanting, "To Colonel Estini!" The right wing had no regrets. Securing an order from Schneider was an unprecedented victory. Normally, these were things that didn't concern them. They could only watch helplessly as orders flowed into the pockets of the left wing. This wasn't just about money, it was about the right wing's resurgence, its control and influence over the military. Colonel Estini wasn't satisfied. He complained, "Saint-Chamond isn't a tank at all, it's at most a gun emplacement, yet it's selling for more than us." The others offered empty agreement or nodded with forced smiles. "As a tank, it should be able to break through enemy lines," Colonel Estini continued. "It should at least be able to cut through barbed wire, cross trenches with the help of infantry, and finally lead troops to break through the lines and outflank the enemy's rear." "Saint-Chamond can't do any of that," everyone nodded in agreement, but no one offered any comment. They couldn't even understand what Estini was saying. Colonel Estini could only turn to Francis. "Sir, what's your opinion?" "That's Schneider, Colonel," Francis replied. "You should be proud of it," Grevy added. "The Saint-Chamond has an electric drive system that can propel this monster weighing over 20 tons at 8.5 kilometers per hour, while our tanks, though lighter, only reach 5 kilometers per hour, something we can't match." "Don't be discouraged, Colonel," Grevy said, raising his glass to Colonel Estini. "We will defeat it one day." Everyone echoed his sentiments. Colonel Estini raised his glass in response, but couldn't hide his disappointment. He would have preferred a discussion about how tanks should operate on the battlefield and what role they could play in the army. But these people only talked about money and interests, and even expressed amazement and envy at the obviously flawed design of the Saint-Chamond. They didn't understand what tanks were, they weren't his type and couldn't possibly share a common language. Was this really what he needed? Colonel Estini thought of Charles. Perhaps he was the one he was looking for. Chapter 138 The Talented Colonel. This was the fifth full day, and the autumn rain was still pattering down. No one doubted that France had entered the rainy season. The roads were full of puddles and mud. Laurent slowed down, carefully maneuvering the steering wheel, and complained to Charles in the back seat, "This is just the beginning, Lieutenant. It's training me on how to drive on the battlefield." Charles smiled in response, thinking that Laurent probably hadn't been to the battlefield. There were far more puddles than this. The car entered Darvest, and the rain-soaked town looked much quieter than usual. There were no pedestrians on the streets, and the roadside vendors were gone, but the guards were still dutifully on duty, standing two on each side at intervals. Charles wondered how Aunt Elisa, who always made a living selling croissants on the street, would do business now. And Uncle Edo, who sold potatoes, was probably haggling with customers under awning. Aunt Anolf, who sold pizzas, was clever. She had converted her house into a shop and was therefore unaffected. Charles saw Antonov lean out and wave at him, and quickly returned the gesture. Suddenly, the car screeched to a halt, nearly hitting his head. Charles looked ahead in confusion, and a soldier with an umbrella blocked his path. Judging from his rank insignia and uniform, he was an artillery colonel. A car parked nearby must have been his. Since his rank was 2 ranks higher than Laurent's, Laurent showed due respect, asking in a low, flat tone, "Hello, Colonel. What can I do for you?" The artillery colonel ignored Laurent and walked straight to Charles, his voice hesitant. "You're Charles. Can I speak with you?" Charles sized up the impetuous artillery colonel. Like most Frenchmen, he had a mustache, but his prominent cheekbones were quite striking. "You are." Charles glanced at the rain outside, the unspoken message being that the weather wasn't suitable for conversation. The artillery colonel extended his hand to Charles. "My name is Estini. You probably haven't heard of me, but you must have heard of my tanks. The CA-1 tank that won the bid not long ago was designed by me. Bang! Laurent pounced over and shoved the artillery colonel into the mud. While struggling to hold down the colonel on the ground, he shouted loudly to both sides, "You bastards, come and help!" Several guards heard the shouts and immediately ran over from both ends of the street. Someone even blew a whistle to call the patrol team, which attracted the neighbors to peek out and watch. Major Laurent and the guards hurriedly disarmed the man, removing his gun and sword. Laurent then berated the guards. "How did you let this guy in?" "He's armed," the guard replied, aggrieved. "He's a soldier, a major, and a colonel." "So what if he's a colonel?" Laurent interrupted. "Does that mean we don't need to ask his identity?" A moment later, Djoka and Camille arrived, having heard the commotion. Seeing the situation, they seemed to understand and rushed to take Charles away. The artillery colonel, blood trickling from his mouth, struggled and shouted at Charles, "Wait, Charles. I want to talk to you, I mean no harm." Charles turned and glanced at the artillery colonel, then nodded. He reassured the terrified Camille and the still wary Djoka, "It's all right. If he wanted to harm me, he wouldn't have revealed his identity first." Laurent recalled the scene and agreed with Charles. The artillery colonel could have simply drawn his gun. Laurent was still uneasy, so he personally searched the artillery colonel thoroughly, even taking out the cigarettes from the colonel's pockets before stopping. In Djoka's hut, the artillery colonel had changed into a set of Djoka's civilian clothes. Because the artillery colonel was slightly thin, he looked somewhat strange in Djoka's clothes. Laurent stood at the door with several guards, not daring to even change out of his soaking wet uniform, worried that the suspect would take advantage of the time he spent changing. The artillery colonel shuddered, touched his swollen lip, and nodded to Djoka and Camille. "I'm very sorry for coming without prior notice, causing you to misunderstand." Charles asked, "Did you come to see your defeated rival, Colonel?" "No, Lieutenant," the artillery colonel said somewhat awkwardly. "I hope. I want to know your opinion on tanks, Lieutenant." Djoka laughed. "You seem to have forgotten we're competitors." "This is the first time I've heard of gathering information this way." The artillery colonel shook his head dejectedly. "I think I was wrong, Mr. Djoka. I'm just an ordinary artillery colonel, who enjoys making modifications and inventions. One day, after I heard that Charles had invented a tank, I wondered if I could put the cannon on it. Many times I've wanted to come to see Charles, but..." Charles nodded to indicate understanding. There was an awkwardness between originality and improvement, the latter being, in a sense, suspected of plagiarism. For example, the CA-1 was simply steel plates erected on a tractor chassis, using the same Hort 60 chassis as the original tank. The only differences were the addition of a 75mm short-barreled cannon and the addition of a pointed nose and fenders for cutting barbed wire. For these reasons, the artillery colonel certainly didn't want to meet with Charles. "Then Mr. Grevy found me," the artillery colonel continued. "He said he was willing to help me, even willing to buy my industrial rights and produce it, and he also owned the tank industrial rights." "So?" Djoka's face lit up with realization. Grevy owned the tank industrial rights. With his consent, the artillery colonel's modifications wouldn't have any problems. The artillery colonel looked embarrassed, tightening his coat before relaxing. "I should have come to you immediately." Camille handed the artillery colonel a steaming cup of coffee, feeling it was only natural hospitality after confirming he meant no harm. The artillery colonel gave her a grateful look and sincerely thanked her. Charles suddenly remembered something and asked, "Colonel, you just said your name is Lieutenant Estini?" The artillery colonel replied. "Estini." Charles nodded slightly. He seemed to vaguely recognize him. The artillery colonel, who usually liked design and invention, must be the one known as the father of French armor. Come to think of it, the German blitzkrieg originated from him. His swarm warfare was probably the prototype of the blitzkrieg. It's just a pity he was born at the wrong time. The tanks of World War I simply couldn't support such advanced combat theories. Should this talented colonel be recruited? Chapter 139 Swarm Tactics. Colonel Estini. Charles steered the conversation back on track. "You seem to have your own opinions on tanks." "You could say that, Lieutenant." Estini nodded. "I think it shouldn't just be a collection of weapons, but also equipment that can have a strategic impact," Charles added. "Yes, that's exactly what I mean." Estini's eyes gleamed with excitement. He had previously felt like there was a thin veil in front of him, everything was blurry, but Charles's words had pierced through it, and the whole world became clear. "I think the most important thing is that it can lead troops to break through enemy lines." Estini got quite into it. setting up a long list of ideas on the table with a tray and coffee cups. Our tanks should be able to cut through barbed wire and cross trenches, of course, with the help of infantry. As he said this, Destiny glanced at Charles. The method of infantry helping tanks cross trenches was also learned from Charles, whose method of quickly filling trenches with sandbags during the Battle of the Marne was deeply ingrained in people's minds. Destiny didn't want to copy it like that, but after thinking about it, he realized there was nothing more suitable. Charles remained unfazed, as this wasn't his usual method. He might as well use it, since it couldn't be used for industrial property rights and wouldn't generate economic benefits. Seeing Charles's reaction, Destiny relaxed, continuing to sketch the battlefield on the table, as if already engaged in a bloody battle amidst gunfire. Once our tanks carrying infantry break through the enemy lines, we shouldn't stop, but rather gather these scattered forces together as a single unit and continue advancing. This way, we can attack the enemy's vulnerable rear, where they are unprepared and easily defeated by our combined tank and infantry force. Then the enemy's logistics will collapse like an avalanche, and the enemy in the lines will lose their fighting capacity due to lack of supplies. Charles nodded slightly. This tactic resembled blitzkrieg, both emphasizing attacking the enemy's weak rear to ultimately encircle them. During World War II, hundreds of thousands, even millions, of troops were forced to surrender under such tactical attacks. However, it still differed from blitzkrieg, being a rudimentary form that didn't consider air-ground coordination. In principle, it remained a two-dimensional, planar warfare tactic. I call it swarm tactics, Destiny said. Because they assemble in the rear like bees, and can disperse again to strike different targets when necessary. As he spoke, excitement and anticipation shone in Destiny's eyes. He could tell from Charles's gaze and thoughtful expression that Charles understood and even agreed with his tactics. This was remarkable. Charles was completely different from Gravy and his men. This was exactly what Destiny wanted. He realized he had made the right choice, that his trip had been worthwhile. However, Destiny didn't expect this was just the beginning. He would soon experience the shock of another era. So, you plan to have tanks cut through barbed wire? Charles countered. Of course, Destiny replied. If we don't do it this way, infantry and tanks can't quickly get through the enemy lines. This was a major highlight of Destiny's CA-1 tank design, and one of the reasons it won the contract in competition with the Saint Chamon. The Saint Chamon couldn't cut through barbed wire, but the CA-1 could. Many counselors believed that the two tanks could complement each other, so they bought both. Charles only said one point that made Destiny fall silent. What if the enemy has a lot of barbed wire? One layer after another, like a jungle of barbed wire in front of us. Would you also try to cut it with your tanks? Destiny was stunned. He hadn't considered this question, but the fact was that there were indeed many jungles of barbed wire on the front lines. Barbed wire was the cheapest and most effective obstacle, and the enemy would try to deploy it in front of their positions as long as they had one ring left. Charles asked again, or, would you choose to attack from a different position? Destiny shook his head. This was obviously not feasible. If he changed positions when he encountered barbed wire, the enemy could simply surround the important breakthrough points with barbed wire. But what can we do? Destiny retorted. Only this way can we get through quickly. That's the infantry's job, Colonel, Charles said softly. You can't expect tanks to do everything. Tanks aren't standalone combat units, they have infantry support. There's even artillery and aircraft. If you had considered these things when you designed it, it would have been much easier. Destiny suddenly understood. This made tanks much simpler. They didn't need to cut through barbed wire, destroy bunkers, and have machine guns to eliminate enemy infantry. They were a part of the combat unit. Destiny stared at Charles, wide-eyed. A branch of service that complements infantry and artillery. Charles nodded. This was a concept in modern warfare, combined arms warfare. But knowing it was one thing, implementing it on the battlefield was another, especially in World War I, where communication equipment was extremely limited. Achieving ideal coordination was incredibly difficult. Nevertheless, planned and systematic training could still achieve initial coordination, which was the correct direction for tank development. Destiny was silent for a moment, imagining this combat mode in his mind. Previously, his tank designs had focused on adding features, hoping to make tanks more powerful and have greater firepower. Now, however, he was thinking about subtracting features, which tasks could be assigned to infantry, which to artillery. Then he exclaimed, the cannon is even unnecessary. It can't hit anything on a tank. Our 75mm gun has strong mobility, why not assign it to the artillery to fire on the ground? Djoka looked at Estany in shock, then turned his gaze to Charles. Djoka and Joseph had been discussing persuading Charles to equip tanks with cannons, believing it was a serious mistake. Now, hearing Estany's words, Djoka realized that perhaps Charles wasn't wrong. He and Joseph were trying to convince Charles with their ignorance. Charles nodded slightly. At least for now, tanks didn't need cannons. Charles looked at Estany with a hint of regret. With artillery, your tanks will only be able to travel at 5 km per hour or 8.5 km per hour. Do you know what that means? Estany suddenly realized, and he stood up in shock. God, they'll be easy targets for enemy artillery. The image above shows a CA-1 tank. The pointed nose and fenders are designed to cut through barbed wire. Chapter 140. This will block their path to wealth. St. Chaman tank's speed of 8.5 km per hour was manageable, equivalent to a slow jog, making it difficult for enemy artillery to hit when deployed in a dispersed manner. However, the CA-1 only reached 5 km per hour. The Hort 60, originally capable of 15 km per hour, had been slowed to the pace of walking due to excessive equipment, and in actual combat, even slower. German artillery was already accustomed to the pace of infantry advances and even knew how much lead to fire. Any tank should try to avoid this pace, but the CA-1, designed by Estany, was precisely synchronized with it. Considering the German artillery's advantages of long range and high power, what could the CA-1, equipped with a 75mm gun, do on the battlefield? They would be blasted into the air by German heavy artillery before even seeing their targets. Estany couldn't sit still any longer. He thanked Djoka and the others and turned to leave, but was stopped by Charles. "Where are you going, Colonel?" Charles asked. "I'm going to withdraw my design," Estany said. "If it's used on the battlefield, it could kill many people." Charles only asked one question: "Did you sell the industrial property rights?" Estany froze at the doorway as if under a spell, turning around palely. "Yes, Lieutenant, Grevy, I bought it for 50,000 francs. Then you can't change anything." Charles shook his head. "Even if you convince them, they won't give up this opportunity to make money, but I should still." Estany wanted to say something, but Charles interrupted him. "They don't even need you anymore. If you go around publicizing the weaknesses of this tank and trying to withdraw it, you know what they will do, right?" Estany was stunned, then nodded slightly. "That will block their path to wealth. They might." Estany sighed. He hadn't expected to be burdened by his own design, or even have his life in danger. Charles said calmly, "Your best option is to pretend you know nothing. Take a long leave and squander the 50,000 francs you just received. That will put their minds at ease. Come back after the CA-1 has problems on the battlefield. You might face a lot of criticism for design flaws, but at least you won't lose your life." Djokovic looked at Charles with surprise. He felt Charles seemed more worldly wise than he had imagined, even though Charles clearly disliked and had never dealt with such matters. Estany nodded in acceptance of the suggestion, then mustered his courage and looked at Charles again. "Lieutenant, can I work for you then?" This might be troublesome for Charles. However, considering that Grevy was originally his enemy, and that Charles needed someone like Estany, he nodded in agreement. At least in the future, he wouldn't be without someone to discuss issues regarding tank design and improvement. Estany excitedly stepped forward and shook Charles's hand. "Thank you so much, Lieutenant, thank you so much." In Estany's eyes, Charles was not only a guide leading him towards wisdom, but also a savior who saved his life. Watching Estany's departing figure, Djoka asked Charles with slight embarrassment, "So, it was Joseph and I who were wrong all along, right?" "I meant putting the cannon on the tank." "Yes," Charles did not deny it. "But why didn't you say so?" Djoka looked at Charles suspiciously. "You could have pointed it out. If I had said so, what would you have thought?" Charles countered. Djoka was stunned. Charles was right, and even if Charles had pointed it out, they would still have thought it was Charles's stubbornness. If this artillery colonel hadn't reached the same conclusion under Charles's guidance, Djoka would never have believed that a tank equipped with a cannon was worse than one without one. After breakfast, Charles went to the Wounded Soldiers Hospital. The Wounded Soldiers Home was actually called a Veterans Welfare Home, mainly to avoid having the words Wounded Soldiers Home hanging on the door, constantly reopening the wounded soldiers' scars. More than 3,000 wounded soldiers had gathered here. They came from different units and regions. Some were rescued by Charles from field hospitals, while others came from elsewhere after hearing about it. Just as Charles had planned, the wounded soldiers used simple machinery to do what they could, earning a living by piecework. The welfare home basically maintained a balance between income and expenditure, neither making a profit nor incurring a loss, not including the occasional food and medicine Charles brought to the welfare home. Charles entered the factory and was immediately greeted warmly by the wounded soldiers. "It's young Master Charles. Perhaps we should call young Master Charles Commander. He's a lieutenant. I wish I could be his subordinate, but unfortunately, I don't have the chance." The wounded soldier's tone carried a hint of self-deprecation. They seemed optimistic, but Charles understood that this was the only way they could bravely face reality. The orphanage director was a one-armed captain named Darius. Before joining the army, he worked as an accountant in a factory, which is why Djoka chose him as director to oversee the orphanage's operations. As soon as Darius saw Charles and Djoka enter, he rushed forward to greet them, saying, "Mr. Djoka, young Master Charles." Darius preferred to call Charles young Master Charles. This was because he knew Charles was lying in a field hospital, his left hand amputated, in a semi-conscious state. Although disoriented, he kept murmuring to the doctor, "Will I die? Am I going to die? I don't want to die, save me." The doctor comforted him, "You won't die. Young Master Charles has provided us with enough supplies. Don't worry. You will survive." Darius, in his dazed state, only remembered the name young Master Charles. He indeed survived and recovered. During this time, he heard countless stories about young Master Charles and his victories on the battlefield. To Darius, young Master Charles was irreplaceable. He felt Charles's current rank was completely beneath him. "We're here to see Matthew," Djoka said. "I remember he's in the tire shop." "Yes," Darius replied, leading the two towards the tire shop as he answered, "Matthew's doing a great job. I've put him in charge of that shop." Charles's pace slowed. Djoka turned back to look at Charles, puzzled. He was unhappy to hear Matthew was doing well. Charles didn't say anything, quickening his pace to catch up. Charles knew Matthew. Matthew was never one to settle for monotonous, repetitive work. He loved dealing with moving machinery. If that was the case, then there was only one reason: he was faking it. He didn't want others to see his inner repression, nor did he want Charles to worry or even hold him back. Chapter 141 The Mechanic. When Charles approached Matthew, he was sitting in a chair, a pair of canes stacked together against a corner of the wall. On the table in front of him sat a motorcycle wheel hub, and he was threading the spokes through it one by one. Matthew saw Charles enter and smiled broadly, his face covered in grime. "Hey, Charles, Mr. Djoka, it's good to see you." Djoka stepped forward and asked, "Are you settling in well here?" Matthew waved his hand around. "It's great, Mr. Djoka, I'm even in charge here. We earn 50 centimes a day, which is almost a worker's wage. What more could we ask for?" Charles didn't waste any words and said directly, "Pick up your canes and come with me." "Where to?" Matthew asked, puzzled. "Your father wants to see you. He has something to say to you," Charles replied. Matthew looked incredulous. At this time? Matthew didn't say anything, but took his cane from the side and followed behind the two, joking with Charles as they walked. "I heard you taught the Germans a lesson again in Ypres? I bet they'll tremble at the mere mention of your name from now on." "Just luck," Charles replied. He didn't want to say too much about it. War easily evoked unpleasant associations. Matthew seemed to understand Charles's meaning, smiled, and said nothing more. The orphanage was located between the motorcycle factory and the tractor factory, to make it easier for the two factories to transport workable parts to the orphanage and then back after completion. It didn't take long for Charles and the others to enter the tractor factory. Matthew's gaze was instantly drawn to Behemoth, a huge diamond-shaped chassis, tracks encircling the entire chassis, and machine gun muzzles protruding from both sides. At that moment, Matthew even forgot why he had come here. Leaning on his cane, he couldn't help but walk half a circle around it, turning to Charles with shock in his eyes and asking, "This is a tank? The new tank you developed? You're amazing, Charles, it's incredible." "No, Matthew," Joseph emerged from the other side of the tank. "This is your tank, What?" Matthew looked at Joseph in confusion. "Charles is planning to hire you as a mechanic." Joseph waved his hand at the tank. "Now, it's yours." "But, my legs?" Matthew turned back to Charles with a questioning look. "You don't need your legs to repair cars or replace parts, do you?" Charles asked, "unless you don't even have the strength to climb onto this tank." Matthew chuckled like a fool, but the smile quickly disappeared, the light in his eyes dimmed, and his tone was full of helplessness. I can't press the accelerator and clutch, Charles. If I can't test drive it, I can't repair it. Why don't you try? Charles said. Matthew looked at Charles with a puzzled expression, then put down his cane and tried to climb up. Joseph wanted to help, but Charles stopped him. Matthew didn't need help, he needed to do everything independently. Finally, Matthew laboriously squeezed into the tank and sat in the driver's seat. Looking down, he excitedly opened the hatch, poked half his head out, and shouted, "You actually thought of extending them to the left foot? I can drive with my left foot." Fantastic, Charles. Fantastic. It wasn't complicated, all it took was an extension rod, which allowed Matthew to drive with his left foot. When it was actually used or when others were testing it, the extension rod could simply be removed. The other crew members entered the tank one after another, and it started with a rumble, then began to move with a clatter. Watching the Mark I whirring around the test track like a fish back in the sea, Charles felt that Matthew had regained his energy. He seemed to hear Matthew cheering loudly inside the tank. "Thank you, Master Charles." Joseph looked at Charles, his eyes reddening and his voice choked with emotion. "You saved Matthew again." "No, Joseph," Charles replied. "I can't find a more suitable mechanic than Matthew." This was the truth. Matthew had grown up in a tractor factory, playing with tractor parts like toys even before he started school. No one knew more about tractors than him. And now, tanks weren't much different from tractors. Hopefully, Matthew wouldn't be content with the status quo and remain at the tractor level, otherwise Charles would have to fire him soon. Brad Manor, a light autumn night, a gentle drizzle. Francis once again urgently summoned a few people for a private meeting. Armand was quite dissatisfied with Francis's choice of this inappropriate time, which disrupted his plans for a nighttime gathering. He irritably lit a cigar and complained, "Everything has been settled, what are you still worried about? Next time, we'll see what time it is." Francis didn't explain. He took out a few photos from his inner garments and threw them on the table. Armand and Greavy picked up the photo and looked at it, their faces showing strange expressions. "What's this?" Armand waved the photo at Francis. Before Francis could speak, Greavy said solemnly, "It's a tank, a Charles tank." Armand looked at the photo a few more times, then laughed. "I don't see a gun barrel, it definitely doesn't have a cannon." Then Armand looked around and asked suspiciously, "Where's Colonel Estini? Did he come, or did we not contact him? This should be the time for him to come out and analyze the tank's performance." Greavy replied, "I contacted him, and I heard he's on vacation with his family." Armand smiled understandingly. After all, he just earned 50,000 francs. That's enough for him to enjoy for a while. He tossed the photo back onto the table, turning his gaze to Francis, a hint of disdain on his lips. "So, do you think this kind of tank without a cannon poses a threat to our tanks?" "I'm not sure, Mr. Armand." Francis met Armand's gaze. "Although I don't believe it will pose a threat to us. Charles has already put it into mass production." Mass production? Armand didn't know what Francis meant. Francis could only explain more clearly. If his tanks are completely ineffective, why would he mass produce them? Even at a cost of 2,000 francs per tank, 100 tanks would cost 200,000 francs. "Do you think Charles would do something at a loss?" Francis shook his head firmly and continued, "No, he has never done anything at a loss, so this isn't so simple." Greavy's eyes remained fixed on the photograph, listening quietly to Francis's analysis. Then he concluded, "There's only one possibility. Charles believes our tanks cannot win, while his tanks can." Armand initially thought Greavy was joking, but seeing Greavy's serious expression, he became cautious. Francis's face changed drastically. He had already invested all his funds in the production of the new tanks. If what Greavy said was true, the order for 400 tanks might be halted, and there would be no further orders. This was undoubtedly adding insult to injury for Francis. Chapter 142 Special Artillery Regiment. At some point, a slight anti-Charles sentiment began to stir in Paris. It didn't originate from the public, but rather from the media, which abruptly shifted its tone before people could even react. The initial effusive praise for Charles turned into skepticism. Charles' tanks didn't even participate in the bidding? Were they ashamed of their inferiority? Has Charles run out of ideas? This is the industrial age. One person's ingenuity can't compete with established arms companies. It's said his tanks don't even have cannons. Some newspapers even went so far as to compare the Saint-Chamond tank with Charles' original tank, the original. While detailed specifications of the Saint-Chamonds weren't published for secrecy, several key points were revealed. The Saint-Chamond had a cannon, 4 machine guns, and an advanced electric drive engine. People, who had initially been full of confidence in Charles, were inevitably swayed by the overwhelming media coverage and skepticism. They still outwardly acknowledged Charles. This is quite remarkable for a 17-year-old. Yes, Charles's victory is unparalleled. Charles is the best, at least for now. No one can surpass him. However, a seed of doubt was planted in their hearts. Was Charles already outdated? He provided the idea, but the one who would truly popularize the tank would be the arms dealers. Charles was still young and inexperienced. Perhaps the task of defeating the Germans should be entrusted to a more strategic and experienced commander. In the Lefus region, in the small town of Fervaux, about 10 kilometers from the front lines. After dawn, the rain suddenly intensified, the bright white raindrops falling merrily, like waterfalls cascading from the sky. Joffre stood by the window of the temporary command post, frowning as he watched the rain waves whipped up by the storm, his heart heavy. He had arrived here in the early morning and set up the command post, even breaking his usual habit of going to bed and waking up on time. But Joffre had no choice. He needed a victory to rebuild his heroic image among the soldiers and civilians, and perhaps only by defeating Charles could he retain his position and regain the command he had lost from Gallieni. General, Deputy Commander Keynes reported to Joffre with a document in hand. 100 CA-1 tanks and 16 Saint-Chamond tanks are on the train, expected to arrive around 2 o'clock this afternoon. Joffre grunted in acknowledgement, then asked without turning his head, "Where is Colonel Christine? Are he and his men ready?" "Of course, General," Keynes replied. "They are eagerly anticipating this battle." "Then let them prepare," Joffre ordered expressionlessly. "We must achieve this victory methodically." "A perfect victory, allowing no mistakes." "Yes, General," Keynes responded. He went to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out a document he had prepared beforehand. He intended to hand it to his staff, but hesitated for a moment, ultimately deciding to go see Colonel Christine himself. Colonel Christine was a combat hero of the First Army. A month ago, during the offensive in Alsace, when the First Army was routed by the Germans and almost everyone was fleeing, Major Christine, then leading over 200 of his men, disguised themselves as corpses and lay on the ground. When the German troops pursuing the French caught up, they suddenly leaped up and attacked with bayonets and swords. The Germans, thinking they had been ambushed, immediately fell into chaos. Christine seized the opportunity and led the 2nd Infantry Battalion to repel the enemy. In that battle, Christine killed 7 men with his sword, and to this day, a scar remains on his face. "France needs heroes like this," Carnes murmured to himself. He walked through the corridor and down the stairs, finally arriving at the sofa in the living room. He said to Colonel Christine, who had risen to attention, "Let's discuss your mission this afternoon, Colonel." "Yes, General," Christine replied. Carnes sat down on the sofa, gesturing for Colonel Christine to sit beside him. He then opened a file folder and handed her a document, his tone approving. "Your troops are very brave, so we intend to reorganize the 1st Infantry Regiment into the 1st Special Artillery Regiment." "Special Artillery Regiment?" Christine was taken aback. "But we're infantry, General. We don't even know how to fire artillery." "You must understand, Colonel," Carnes explained with a smile. "We don't need you to know how to fire artillery, you will still fight like infantry." I don't quite understand, General." Christine's mind was a mess. If they were still fighting like infantry, why call them artillery? A hint of mystery flickered in Keynes's eyes. "Have you heard of tanks, Colonel?" "Of course, General." Christine suddenly realized something. "You mean, we'll be fighting alongside tanks?" "Yes, and the most advanced tanks in France." Keynes's eyes shone with pride. He took another document from his file folder and carefully handed it to Christine as if it were a treasure, patting it lightly twice with a meaningful expression. "A total of 100 CA-1 tanks and 16 Saint-Chamond tanks. It represents the most powerful military force in France. It's yours, Colonel." Christine took the document and carefully opened it, finding detailed data and firepower configurations for the Saint-Chamond and CA-1 tanks, along with photographs from various angles. Christine was somewhat at a loss. "But General, how can we coordinate with these tanks?" "Just like I said," Keynes said confidently, "you just need to fight as usual, and the tanks will cut through the enemy's barbed wire and lead you through the lines." Keynes leaned back on the sofa, his tone relaxed. "Think about it, each tank carries a 75mm cannon and 2 to 4 machine guns. They are an armory, Colonel. Advancing with you is an armory, A total of 116 cannons and 264 machine guns. They will wipe out everything that stands in your way. All of them, Keynes concluded, and your troops, all you have to do is advance with them and capture the enemy positions, understand. A hint of envy even flashed in Keynes's eyes, as if to say, lucky fellow, the first large-scale tank battle victory in human history is about to fall on your head. You should be honored. Understood, General, Christine replied stiffly. His gaze never left the documents in his hands. He found it hard to believe the battle could be so easy. Based on his past experience, actual combat was often very different from imagination. Were these generals, who spent so much time holed up in their offices, underestimating the Germans as easy to deal with? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 143 Press Conference. Joffre ate lunch promptly at 11:30. His lunch consisted of a steak, 2 fried eggs, some broccoli, and purple radishes. He considered a balanced diet essential. After lunch, he spent some time drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, his way of relaxing, something he always did when something important happened, even though he sometimes read the same newspapers. Soon the clock on the wall struck 1:30 p.m. Just then, Carnes pushed open the door and reported, General, all the tanks are in place. Joffre was somewhat surprised, a little earlier than expected. Yes, Carnes replied, the trains were miraculously on time. That's perhaps a good omen, Carnes. Joffre smiled. Have the reporters arrived? Yes, they're all in the reception room. Carnes bent down and asked, should you go and talk to them first? No, Joffre shook his head. Let them wait a little longer. Joffre understood that while the reporters waited, they would spread their speculation through various channels, which would garner more public attention and anticipation. Colonel Christine, fully armed and clad in raincoats, stood with her men in the rain as they watched tanks drive past, finally stopping in front of the barracks under the direction of ground crew. The thick armor, massive hulls, and dark cannons and gun barrels made them look like steel monsters. Excitement and elation gleamed in the soldiers' eyes. Though lined up, their gazes couldn't help but drift towards the imposing tanks. Christine sensed something was amiss. The soldiers seemed to share a misconception that this is an easy victory. Christine cleared her throat, stepped forward, and, chest puffed out, warned in a deep voice, pay attention, don't be misled by what you see. War is about people, not equipment. You must never let your guard down. The battlefield is a battlefield. It will always teach those who underestimated a harsh lesson. The soldiers responded in unison. Yes, sir. Christine glanced at the soldiers, noticing that while they responded verbally, their faces remained indifferent. Christine sighed inwardly, hoping the battle would be as easy as they said. After the soldiers dispersed, they swarmed into the tank formation, curiously looking around. Some even tried to ingratiate themselves with the tank crews, hoping to sneak inside for a look. Christine walked slowly through the rain to the tanks. They were all olive green, not the dark gray of battlefield equipment, but the paint commonly used for factory machinery. Christine gently touched them, finding the paint not fully dry and slightly sticky. It wasn't hard to imagine that these tanks had been rushed into production. Christine's worries deepened. Was this really all right? No problem. In the reception room, Joffre, impeccably dressed and full of vigor, stood under the reporter's flashing lights, calm yet confident. Gentlemen, please imagine this. Back in the Battle of the Marne, the tanks we used were armored steel plates with machine guns. Note, only one machine gun, and it was a Hotchkiss, but these tanks routed dozens of times their size of the German army, scaring them into rout. Now, the two tanks we've developed both have cannons and increased machine gun numbers. Their firepower is unmatched by any previous tanks. At that moment, a burst of intense artillery fire came from outside, and the reporters gasped and turned their gazes to the window. This is just artillery preparation, gentlemen. In a few minutes, our first Special Artillery Regiment will launch the attack. Everything is proceeding according to plan. Boom, 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 boom. The artillery fire exploded in the misty rain, kicking up plumes of smoke and dust. The moisture instantly turned into steam as the gunpowder heated up, making the fire appear much more intense than usual. Huge, cotton-like plumes of smoke rolled in front of and behind the enemy lines, further obscuring the already chaotic vision. The artillery preparation was scheduled for 10 minutes. But after 8 minutes, Colonel Christine blew the whistle to signal the attack. This wasn't because Colonel Christine was eager to seize territory, but because he knew it would buy his troops 2 minutes to advance. If we can push these cumbersome things to the enemy lines, it will be more advantageous, Colonel Christine thought. Their firepower can suppress the enemy face to face. Whistles echoed through the rain, and the tanks rumbled to life, soldiers gripping their rifles and crouching low as they followed around them. Christine immediately noticed the problem. Some infantrymen hadn't realized they were blocking the tank's machine gun. "Get away from the tank," Colonel Christine shouted. But it was no use. As soon as one infantryman was pulled away, another would take his place, some even blocking the tank's tracks. "We will break through the enemy's lines methodically." Joffre picked up his baton from the table, and his assistant quickly turned on the projector and inserted a slide. A black and white image of a CA-1 tank appeared on the backdrop behind Joffre. "Gentlemen," Joffre stepped forward with a flourish, the black and white light casting an odd shadow on him. "Let me introduce our vanguard tank, the CA-1. It was designed by one of our artillery colonels. Notice its nose." Joffre pointed ahead with his baton. "These pointed noses and fenders will slice through enemy barbed wire like blades. The enemy's first line of defense will be obliterated by its charge." On the battlefield, Christine watched in astonishment as several of the leading CA-1 tanks were stuck in shell craters, one of them emitting smoke, seemingly from an overloaded engine. Suddenly, the whistling of artillery shells filled the air. Christine immediately realized it was enemy fire. "Get down," Christine shouted, lunging forward into a crater filled with dirty water. The lower you were, the greater your chances of survival. No one cared what was inside. Boom. Boom. After a burst of artillery fire, Colonel Christine was stunned by what she saw when she peeked out again. The CA-1 tanks were a complete mess. Some were on fire, some were overturned, and others were reduced to scrap, with fragments scattered everywhere. Many others appeared undamaged on the surface, but their armor was riddled with small holes from shrapnel. Without a doubt, the tank crew inside must have been mangled beyond recognition. "What could it possibly have protected us from?" Colonel Christine exclaimed incredulously. "Is this what they meant by an easy victory?" The image above shows a slide projector, invented in 1654, initially using candles as a light source, later developed into electric lights. Chapter 144 The Most Powerful War Machine. "They can protect us from any attack." Ziafa'i pointed to the armor of the CA-1 tank and introduced it with great enthusiasm. "The front and sides are made of riveted steel plates, 11 millimeters thick." "Do you know why it's 11 millimeters?" Ziafa'i waved to the reporters, believing that interacting with them would liven up the atmosphere. A reporter raised his hand. Ziafa'i remembered him, Cobdo from the Morning Post, a reporter skilled in military writing. Ziafa'i gestured for him to answer. Cobdo stood up and adjusted his glasses. "I think it's because the German Mauser rifles can only penetrate 10 millimeters of steel plate, General." Ziafa'i nodded in satisfaction. "Yes, enemy bullets can only penetrate 10 millimeters, and it sets the armor thickness at 11 millimeters, not a millimeter more or less. Do you think the Germans will be worried about that?" A burst of teasing laughter came from the reporters in the reception room. Someone chimed in, "I think they'll be so angry they'll shit themselves, General." This remark drew another round of snickers. Joffre spread his hands, feigning innocence. "I'm sorry, but I wish it were this way." The laughter in the hall grew even louder. Christine's eyes were filled with fear as he directed the infantry to continue their slow advance around the tanks. The tanks occasionally fired towards the enemy, but Christine thought it was useless. He noticed that sometimes the shells exploded several kilometers away from the enemy lines, while others were almost within inches of their own men. If Christine knew the situation inside the tanks, he might be even more distraught. With each shell fired, the resulting toxic gas instantly filled the tank compartment and couldn't escape. This not only nearly suffocated the crew but, more terrifyingly, blurred their vision, preventing the driver from seeing the infantrymen lying on the ground taking cover from the shells. The screams of the infantrymen rang out continuously, soldiers with legs crushed by the tracks cursing wildly, but the tanks continued to advance along their routes on their own. They couldn't see or hear, only relying on luck to stumble and crash through the battlefield. "Follow the tanks," Colonel Christine shouted the order. The officers immediately relayed his command. "They can at least stop bullets," Colonel Christine thought, believing it might be safer to follow behind. However, to Christine's dismay, he soon heard a crisp clanging sound nearby. followed by several CA-1 tanks coming to a stop. Rifles. Christine immediately realized that the enemy had pierced the CA-1 tanks with rifles from the front. What was going on? The next second, Christine understood. The Germans must have improved their ammunition, increasing its penetrating power. Just as he had thought, the Germans weren't stupid, they also considered how to deal with tanks. Christine paused for a moment, then thought of the Saint-Chamond, whose armor was 17 millimeters thick. He should bring them up. But when he turned around, he saw the massive figures of Saint-Chamond tanks standing motionless behind him, seemingly observing from the rear. These cowards, Christine cursed, assuming the crews driving the Saint-Chamond had given up. This is just our vanguard. Joffre raised his hand to signal his assistant to change the slides, and instantly a colossal figure appeared on the wall. A murmur of amazement and envy rippled through the reporters. Now, Joffre's voice grew increasingly excited. Allow me to proudly introduce to you the Saint-Chamond tank, developed by Schneider Electric, the most powerful weapon in France. Joffre glanced triumphantly at the reporters below and declared proudly, it has 12 millimeters of frontal armor and 17 millimeters of side armor. So far, no bullet has been able to penetrate it. It uses the most advanced electric drive engine. It's a unique war machine. Perhaps we should call it art. Note, early versions of the Saint-Chamond did indeed have models with thicker side armor than frontal armor. This was because the designers believed that the larger exposed area of the side armor made it more vulnerable to attack, thus requiring thicker armor. The reporters murmured amongst themselves, nodding frequently. Some even gazed at the steel monster on the wall with admiration, imagining its heroic figure sweeping across the battlefield. Joffre seemed to understand the reporters' thoughts. He smiled, puffed out his chest, and said easily and confidently, rest assured, gentlemen, they are cooperating with our valiant soldiers to charge towards the enemy positions. Let us wait and see, and witness the miracle together. Applause erupted in the hall, and reporters cheered, for France, Vive la France. Others joined in shouting Vive la, and the atmosphere reached a fever pitch. At this moment, Keynes walked in, pale and embarrassed. He whispered something in Joffre's ear. Joffre looked at Keynes in shock, his eyes filled with disbelief, as if waiting for a different answer. However, Keynes shook his head helplessly, indicating that he wasn't joking. This was the final result. Joffre paused for a moment, then immediately turned to the reporters. Excuse me, gentlemen. I need to continue commanding the battle. This press conference is adjourned. Please go back and wait for news of our victory. He then left without looking back, leading Keynes away. The reporters behind him murmured amongst themselves, weren't we told to wait here for victory? Why are we suddenly being sent back? Is it over just like that? What's the progress on the battlefield? How many enemy lines did we break through? Suddenly, a voice rang out, has the battlefield changed? We didn't win this battle. The hall fell silent instantly. Although the reporters couldn't believe that such powerful tanks could lose, this seemed to be the only plausible explanation. Otherwise, they should be interviewing the victorious soldiers by now. The reporter from Le Figaro winked at his assistant, who understood and got up to leave the hall. The news soon reached Grévy's villa. He grunted, put down the phone, and slowly sat down on the sofa, lighting a cigar. Although it was expected, he still didn't understand how Charles could have predicted a defeat so accurately. Was it a problem with the artillery? Or some other reason? Grévy wasn't interested in these things. He only knew that if things continued to develop, Charles and his tanks would be victorious. This was Charles's plan. Gallieni had been closely monitoring the battle at Lafis, receiving the intelligence a few minutes later than Grévy. This was because Joffre attempted to suppress information and conceal military intelligence. As before, however, Gallieni had made prior arrangements, and the intelligence still reached the city's defense command. Gallieni, his face grim, hung up the phone and immediately ordered, call Charles back immediately. Now. Chapter 145 Conditions. This was the first time Charles had been summoned to headquarters by Gallieni while on leave. Charles was taking a nap at the time. Several factories were running smoothly under Joca's management, but the only drawback was that the aircraft manufacturing plant was too far from the town of Darvaz, making it inconvenient for Joca to manage. Therefore, Charles had some time to do his own thing. Just as Charles was waking up and still groggy, Laurent's voice came from outside the door. Lieutenant, the general wants you back at headquarters immediately. On the way, Charles learned the general situation of the battle. More than 1,000 casualties, and the loss of 59 CA-1 tanks and 15 Saint-Chamond tanks. Most of the Saint-Chamond tanks were not destroyed by the enemy, but were stuck in shell craters and unable to move. The Germans didn't even notice them for quite some time. Even so, the French engineers still couldn't pull them back from the battlefield. These tanks were too heavy, weighing 27 tons and still tracked. Several cars couldn't even move them when they were stuck in the shell craters. Then, as the rain subsided, tragedy struck again. The Germans discovered the tanks and shelled the area. The shells not only shattered the Saint-Chamond, but also killed or wounded hundreds of engineers and destroyed over a dozen vehicles. Laurent lamented, "No one expected the highly anticipated Saint-Chamond to perform so poorly on the battlefield." Joffre even invited reporters from major newspapers and media outlets to La Foux, intending to publicize the victory immediately. Now he shot himself in the foot, but Charles disagreed. Joffre was a heroic figure cultivated in France by capitalists through propaganda, a pillar of strength. The capitalists wouldn't let him fall easily, especially during wartime. On the other hand, the opposing forces, CA-1 with right-wing support and Schneider's Saint-Chamond on the left, both controlled propaganda tools. They could also bribe certain newspapers and media outlets outside their control. Therefore, the final outcome was likely a shift in focus or a quieter handling of the situation. With time, it would fade from public memory and wouldn't affect Joffre. Sure enough, as Charles got out of the car, he overheard people whispering, "I heard it's a design flaw in the tanks, which caused the military to suffer heavy losses." Yes, it has little to do with the soldiers in combat, they fought very bravely, it's because the designers don't understand battlefield conditions, they're out of touch with reality. This is the magic of controlling the narrative. Capitalists cleverly shift people's attention to the military, soldiers, and designers, making people choose someone to take responsibility. But in reality, they have nothing to do with the matter. The person truly responsible has already taken a large sum of money from the military and continues to hide behind the scenes. Gallieni saw Charles come up and go straight into the lounge. He sat in a chair, his face ashen, and said helplessly, "What you feared has indeed happened, Lieutenant. Our tanks haven't even seen the enemy, they're completely on the defensive." This was within Charles's expectations. Tank crews only have a small observation port for visibility, and with heavy rain or even torrential downpours during the fighting, it's impossible to see the enemy clearly. "Is your tank up to par?" Gallieni asked. Charles's attitude was ambiguous. "It should work. I'm not so sure, General." Charles wasn't in a hurry. If the military wanted to make a breakthrough on the defensive line, they would have to consider tanks, and now Charles was the only tank supplier left. The military had no choice but to buy them. Therefore, Charles didn't need to make any promises to the military. He adopted a take-it-or-leave-it attitude, completely indifferent. Gallieni seemed to see through Charles's thoughts. He smiled slightly, tapping his fingers lightly on the table, and his tone turned stern. "Lieutenant, I need you to provide a detailed evaluation report on the tanks produced by Charles Tractor Factory. Give it to me within half an hour." "Can you do that?" Charles was taken aback. "Here we go again?" Then Gallieni added, "You're not trying to tell me you don't know anything about this tank, are you?" "No, General, I know this tank," Charles could only answer. "Very good," Gallieni nodded in satisfaction. "So, are you going to tell me in the assessment report, or give me the answer now?" Charles stepped forward and said, reporting, "General, Charles tanks can break through the enemy's lines, but there are conditions." "What conditions?" Gallieni asked with interest. Charles replied, "I need Colonel Brownie of the 5th Army and his troops." Gallieni nodded in agreement. Colonel Brownie was one of the first commanders to cooperate with Charles, a fact known throughout the land after the Battle of the Marne. They called Charles the inventor and Brownie the commander. Charles' request for Colonel Brownie's troops to cooperate with him was perfectly reasonable. "Anything else?" Gallieni asked. "The 1st Air Group might also be needed," Charles added. Gallieni nodded in agreement without much thought. These were troops originally under Charles' command, so it wasn't much of a request. Then Charles lowered his voice, his tone slightly hesitant. "I also need an artillery colonel. His name is Estany." Gallieni was taken aback. "Estany? Who is that?" Charles's voice was even lower. "The developer of the CA-1. "No, that's impossible." Gallieni looked at Charles suspiciously. "If he developed the CA-1, then he's from the right wing." The right wing had conflicts and contradictions with Charles, and Gallieni certainly knew who had lured Charles to Antwerp. And now Charles actually wanted to join forces with the right wing? No, General, Charles explained, it's just Colonel Estany. I have no intention of joining forces with the right wing. Colonel Estany designed the CA-1 for the right wing for some reason, and he contacted me. Hearing Charles say this, Gallery remembered, is that the guy Laurent beat up a few days ago? Laurent had reported this to Gallery, but Gallery hadn't taken it to heart. Yes, Charles nodded. I need him to train the tank units. Brownie was better suited to be a frontline commander, directing operations on the battlefield. He only needed to know what to do and then command a battle according to a set of systematic rules. Colonel Estany, however, needed to know why, because only by knowing and fully understanding the military theory of coordinated operations that Charles spoke of could he be a qualified instructor training troops. Gallery replied expressionlessly, I reserve my opinion on that. I will investigate and get back to you. As he spoke, Gallery shook his head slightly, as if to say, this kid is too trusting. If this Colonel Estany is sent by the right wing, you will lose everything. Then Gallery snorted. If Estany really is a spy, then he will regret it. Chapter 146 Special Training. Charles also considered this possibility. Could Colonel Estany be a spy sent by Grevy? If so, it would undoubtedly be a brilliant move by Grevy, as Estany would learn tank design principles and even advanced combat theories from Charles. However, Charles believed that Colonel Estany was not a spy. If he were, Grevy should have learned about the CA-1's weaknesses from Estany and prevented its deployment. Grevy was not short of money. Everything he did was to enhance the right wing's influence within the military, and defeat and embarrassment would clearly contradict this goal. More importantly, Colonel Estany was a historical figure, known as the father of French armored tanks, who not only developed the CA-1 tank but also a heavy tank, the Char B-1. During the German invasion of France in World War II, one Char B-1 encountered 13 German tanks, and all 13 German tanks were destroyed while the Char B-1 remained intact. This tank was thus nicknamed the Battle Giant by the French. Colonel Estany, a tank designer and developer obsessed with tank warfare theory, was incompatible, even opposed, to those on the right wing who opposed industrialization. If Grevy were to place Estany under Charles's wing as a spy, the most likely outcome would be that once released, he couldn't be taken back. Someone as shrewd as Grevy wouldn't do that. Any other conditions? Gallieni asked. No, Charles replied. However, perhaps 2 to 3 weeks of training will be needed. 2 weeks. Gallieni's tone left no room for argument. General, Gallieni interrupted Charles, Colonel Brownie and his troops have training and combat experience. 2 weeks should be enough. Charles knew why Gallieni was in such a hurry. Joffre would continue the offensive on the front lines using those 2 failed tank designs. If one tactic didn't work, he'd switch to another until success, then use the media for massive publicity. Therefore, every day Charles's tanks were delayed in reaching the battlefield, and achieving victory meant more casualties for the frontline troops. Gallieni didn't want to see this happen and could only urge Charles to expedite the process. Charles's lack of a direct answer was tantamount to acknowledgement. He said, perhaps you should be more concerned about how much my tanks will cost, General. This immediately struck at Gallieri's weak point. The military was not only short of money but also facing a severe deficit. However, Gallieri hesitated only briefly before scoffing. They can spend over 13 million francs on a pile of useless junk, so they should be able to afford your tanks. No loans. Charles was somewhat surprised. No loans, Gallieri answered firmly, but your price must be within a reasonable range. Charles hesitated for a moment before offering a price, 10,000 francs. It's a deal, Gallieri agreed before Charles could finish. Charles was stunned. His Mark I tanks, because they directly used existing blueprints and engines and were pieced together from modified tractor tracks, had very low development costs and production costs, costing less than 3,000 francs per tank. Based on previous deals with the military, a doubling of 5 or 6,000 francs would have been enough, meaning a 100% profit margin. Considering Gallieni's stingy nature, Charles intentionally set a high price to let him negotiate, but to his surprise, Gallieni agreed so readily. What Charles didn't know was that Gallieni had a different plan in mind. The CA-1 tank cost 12,000 francs, the Saint Chamond tank 21,000 francs, but both were ineffective on the battlefield. Based on that calculation, the tank Charles had that could win battles should cost at least 20,000 francs. Who would have thought Charles would start with 10,000? Charles was indeed a capitalist with a conscience, quickly closing the deal. So, Without much thought, he agreed on the spot. Gallieni then said, "An initial order of 100 tanks, is that alright?" He was a little worried that the order quantity was too small. After all, he had ordered 400 of each of the two types of tanks that had suffered defeats. "No problem," Charles swallowed hard, "another deal worth 1 million francs. The key point is that his Marquis was originally a transitional product, with a planned production of only around 100 units. More would be pointless, as it would soon be phased out." Charles felt a pang of regret. He should have set the price higher. Estany was vacationing with his family in Provence, over 700 kilometers away. They had spent a full day and a half traveling by train and car to reach their destination. They had hoped to relax for a few days in this place far from the battlefield and the smoke of war, but when he woke up that morning and bought a newspaper, he saw the headline, "CA1 tank and Saint-Chamond suffer setbacks, suspected design problems." Estany wasn't angry. Instead, he was delighted. He tossed the newspaper aside, and while changing his clothes, said to his wife, who was still in bed, "You and the children stay here, darling. I'm leaving the money for you, I have to go back." His wife, still half asleep, mumbled and drifted back to sleep. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and found that Estany had already left. The Fifth Army was stationed in the Lickel region near the Somme River. As the defensive line gradually solidified, Colonel Brownie and his chevaux de frise unit could no longer conduct harassment and special operations as before. General Gard decided to make use of this chevaux de frise unit, sending them back and forth to transport supplies and the wounded. Colonel Brownie was resistant to this task, believing that supply transport didn't need soldiers like them, but he worried that if he said so, all the chevaux de frise would be confiscated. "You don't need them anyway. Just assign them to the logistics units, and you can go back to infantry." Therefore, Colonel Brownie could only appear enthusiastic as he directed his troops back and forth. That night, when everyone had returned to camp to rest after a long day, Colonel Brownie received a call from General Gard. "Colonel, congratulations. General Gallieni plans to transfer you to Paris for a special training exercise organized by Charles." "Really? That's fantastic," Colonel Brownie exclaimed. "Thank you, General, thank you so much, but your sidecar motorcycles belong to the Fifth Army, you should leave them behind." "What? I can't hear you," I said. "You must leave the sidecar motorcycles behind." "Sorry, General. The signal is too bad, I can't hear you." "Leave the sidecar motorcycles behind." "Yes, General. I'll report right away, right now, I won't be late." With that, Brownie slammed down the phone, waved to his men, and shouted, "Did you hear that? A special training exercise organized by Charles. Prepare to depart." The soldiers cheered. The image above shows a Charles B-1 heavy tank with 2 cannons. Chapter 147 Basic Functions of Tanks. Colonel Brownie, a reckless fellow, led his 3rd Infantry Regiment to the town of Daza at 1 a.m. Nearly 2,000 men in over 500 sidecars, their engines roaring and headlights flashing, heavily armed. They were stopped by guards at the town's entrance. Normally, the guards wouldn't dare stop soldiers coming from the battlefield, but having learned from the experience with the artillery colonel, they had no choice but to approach this seemingly unfriendly force. Unsurprisingly, an argument ensued, and the commotion alerted the townspeople. They assumed the capitalists had sent troops to harm Charles in the middle of the night, and surprisingly, they quickly organized a militia. Charles, sound asleep at home, was suddenly awakened. He opened his eyes to pale-faced Camille. Still groggy and confused, he was led away by a nervous Djoka, and they attempted to escape through another intersection under the cover of the militia. Finally, Major Laurent arrived and called headquarters to check. He confirmed there was indeed a transfer order for Colonel Brownie, clearing up the misunderstanding. Colonel Brownie, completely unaware of the mess he'd made, greeted the disheveled Charles with excitement. "Hey, Lieutenant, long time no see. Where are you going so late? How about we give you a ride? Your sidecar is really useful, and your tactics have helped us defeat many enemies." He, seeing the murderous glares around him, Colonel Brownie's laughter finally turned into a dry, awkward laugh. Charles looked helpless. He had originally wanted to keep a low profile, not wanting the media to know too soon about his transfer to the unit for special training, but Brownie had made the whole town a scene of chaos and gossip. Sure enough, the next day the newspapers launched a series of speculations and associations. The commander of the Battle of the Marne, along with his troops, has been transferred back to the town of Darwade and is currently stationed at Charles's factory. Is Ghillie doing this in hopes of recreating the victory of the Battle of the Marne? With sidecars have no protection whatsoever. Can Charles use them to defeat Schneider and create another miracle? Now there were no secrets left. The Germans only needed to buy a newspaper to know Charles's preparation schedule, even the unit numbers, where they were training, and that Charles's tanks would be exposed sooner or later. The thought had barely formed when they discovered that a photo of the Mark I had already appeared in the newspaper. The media launched into a sarcastic tirade. "My God, is this the new tank Charles developed? It looks strange. It's said to only have 3 machine guns, 2 of which are Hotchkiss. He hopes to defeat the Germans with such tanks? And the military actually bought 100 of them." Ghillie was furious. The battle hadn't even started, and the enemy had already figured out everything. Was he going to have to tell the enemy the battle plan next? You should consider the secrecy of the factory. Ghillie had never lost his temper with Charles before, and even when he did, it was usually half joking. But this time, he remained stern. "If you can't do it, I'll help you solve it." "No, General," Charles replied, "I can do it, but what? One day, my tanks must be driven from Darvis to the Paris train station." Charles's expression was helpless. "Only in this way can the tanks be sent to the battlefield. How can we hide the tanks' movements along the way?" Ghillie thought about it and realized it made sense. If reporters were to stay near the factory, they could accurately know the tanks' departure time, and then the Germans would know Charles's attack time. After a moment's consideration, he ordered, "This is no difficult task. Build a railway to Days." Thus, a railway was simultaneously constructed by 5 teams, with Ghillie planning to open it 2 weeks prior. It had no direct stops along the route to the Charles tractor factory, instead having a dedicated train station within the factory premises. As for secrecy within the factory, Charles simply gave Joka a perfunctory instruction, not taking it seriously. What needed to be revealed had already been revealed. Colonel Estienne arrived in Paris the following evening. Upon disembarking from the train, he was immediately apprehended by Ghillie's men. He was then interrogated throughout the night until it was confirmed he was innocent. When Estienne arrived at the Charles tractor factory, his eyes were bloodshot, and his face was contorted with exhaustion. This was a common method Ghillie used when interrogating suspects. He believed that people speaking when extremely tired were more likely to be telling the truth, and this couldn't even be called corporal punishment, just simple questioning. Clearly, Estienne had passed this test. Charles led Brownie and Estienne to the Mark I tank, nodding at it. "You have 2 weeks to learn how to operate in conjunction with it, and then defeat the Germans." Brownie remained calm, neither excited by the tank's massive size nor disappointed by its lack of a cannon. This was what Charles wanted. A professional soldier should focus on whether a tank was suitable for the battlefield and helpful to the mission, not whether it carried powerful weapons. Estienne circled the tank halfway, growing increasingly excited, his fatigue gradually disappearing, making him seem several years younger. "Lieutenant," Estienne returned to Charles's side, his eyes filled with uncertainty, and hesitated before saying, "I guess it's for trench crossing." Charles nodded. As expected of a tank design expert, he immediately recognized the Mark I's primary purpose. Charles walked around the tank for a while, Estienne following behind like a student, head bowed and hands at his sides, while Colonel Brownie strolled around casually, left hand gripping his sword at his waist, right hand touching and looking at various items as if shopping in a supermarket. Charles ignored Brownie and asked Estienne, "Colonel, what do you think is the most basic function of a tank?" Estienne considered for a moment, then cautiously answered as if answering a teacher's question, "To cover the advance of infantry and break through enemy lines." He thought of the Battle of the Marne, where Charles's original tanks served this purpose. Charles nodded. If even this goal cannot be achieved, Estienne suddenly realized, then all weapons become meaningless. God, we've all overlooked this point, which is why the CA-1 and Saint-Chamond suffered such a crushing defeat. This was crucial. During World War I, the tank's primary role was as a shield, providing cover for infantry and preventing them from being massacred by enemy machine guns. To achieve this, tanks needed a certain speed to avoid being easily blown away by enemy artillery fire. Furthermore, tanks needed a certain level of protection and trench crossing capability. Otherwise, on the battlefield, they would either be stuck in shell craters or penetrated by enemy rifles, unable to even reach the enemy. What would be the point of piling weapons on them then? Happy Dragon Boat Festival, everyone! I'm spending the holiday with family today, so I only have 4 chapters. Please allow me a few days to rest. My usual update schedule is 3 chapters a day, but please forgive me if I can't manage 3. I'll be back in full force in a few days, and there will be even more updates. Cyrillic letter Ven. Chapter 148 covering the tank flankings. Charles continued, this tank is called the Mark I, with 83 horsepower. Its engine is similar to the St. Chamont's 90 horsepower, but the St. Chamont weighs 27 tons, while the Mark I only weighs 17 tons. This was thanks to Matthew, who simplified the Mark I's structure by removing unnecessary parts. Some of these parts were designed to make it easier to convert a tractor into a bulldozer, which the tank didn't need. What about its speed? Estony asked expectantly. He understood the importance of speed. It didn't need to be too fast, but it needed to be able to evade enemy fire for the tank to survive. If it couldn't even survive on the battlefield, it couldn't provide cover for infantry, it would even become a burden. The answer was obvious, with similar horsepower to the St. Chamont but half the weight, its speed would definitely be faster. Sure enough, Charles replied, initial tests show it can reach 11 kilometers per hour on flat ground. Estony's eyes lit up. This was significantly faster than the St. Chamont's 8.5 kilometers per hour. We must be clear on one point. Charles's gaze shifted to the machine gun protruding from the side of the tank. At least for now, we're mounting weapons on tanks for self-defense, not to kill the enemy. Understood? Estony exclaimed, as if struck by a sudden realization. Killing the enemy should be the infantry's job. The tank's mission is to advance with heavy armor, covering the infantry's breakthrough of the lines. The Mark I was designed for this purpose. Its unique diamond-shaped hull and tracks encircling the entire hull allowed it to traverse most obstacles. Even trenches could be easily crossed without sandbags. Then Estony suddenly remembered something and said with concern, Lieutenant, the Germans may have improved their ammunition. It's said that their rifles can now penetrate the 12mm frontal armor of the St. Chamont. Charles nodded. That was the legendary German K bullet. They had replaced their rifle bullets with steel core or even tungsten core bullets, enabling them to penetrate 13mm of steel plates. But Charles had, of course, taken this into account, and he replied, Mark I has 17mm frontal armor and 11mm side armor. The frontal armor was sufficient to protect against German K rounds, and the side armor protected against ordinary enemy rifle bullets. This was why the Mark I, despite lacking a cannon and machine guns, still weighed 17 tons. Note, the British Mark I had armor thickness of 6 to 12mm and weighed 28 tons. Hearing these figures, Estony was reassured. He imagined the tank on a battlefield amidst flying bullets, braving enemy fire, crossing ditches and trenches to advance towards the enemy, with soldiers following closely behind, ultimately breaking through the enemy's lines. However, Estony was still somewhat worried about the flanks. He frowned. The moment the tank crosses the trench seems to be the most dangerous. At that time, its speed is probably very slow, and the flank area is large enough. The Germans are hiding in the trenches. If they have K rounds, Charles turned his gaze to the absent-minded Brownie behind him. That's the infantry's job. Colonel Brownie was a little impatient. Kid, all that talk is useless. Don't you think we should drive it around and practice? Practice a few times like before, and we'll know how to fight. The rest is up to you. Brownie was that kind of person. As long as he was told how to fight, he trusted Charles to think everything through, and he could achieve victory by following his instructions. Charles replied unhurriedly, Sorry, Colonel, I think you should learn this first. As he spoke, Charles nodded to Joseph, who was waiting to the side. Joseph understood and called several workers to carry 2 long boxes up and pile them in front of Colonel Brownie. Colonel Brownie opened the box and saw it filled with objects that looked like wooden handles. He picked one up curiously and turned to Charles. What's this? A grenade, Colonel? Charles replied. Open the safety cover at the tail, pull the pin, and throw it towards the enemy. It will explode in a few seconds. However, these were all training rounds, with the same weight and size as live ammunition. Brownie immediately understood. He had been busy transporting supplies and evacuating wounded soldiers, some of whom had been injured by German hand-thrown explosives. He had heard many of these wounded soldiers complain, What is our government doing? The Germans have special explosives. They can just pull the pin and throw them into our trenches, blasting a whole bunch of us down, and we have to make our own by filling tin cans with gunpowder and attaching fuses. Can't they invent something useful? Some even said to Brownie, Hey, I heard you're a friend of Charles's. Why don't you ask him to invent an easy-to-throw explosive? Brownie would always pat his chest and reply, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." However, he would always forget about it as soon as he turned around. Seeing the grenade, Brownie held it with obvious delight. "Hey, kid, how many of these do you have? I think the soldiers on the front lines really need them." "Don't worry," Charles said, "it will be deployed to the front lines soon. After we break through Lapis." The St. Etienne Armory was currently producing 20,000 grenades a day, and production would be expanded later. As long as the military was willing to buy them, there would be enough of these simple and practical gadgets on the battlefield. Estienne hadn't initially paid much attention to the grenade, but after thinking about it carefully, he hesitated and looked at Charles. "Lieutenant, this thing, you plan to use it to cover the flanks of the tanks?" Charles nodded. This was one of Estienne's strengths. He didn't need drills or explanations. He could guess from imagination that the grenade was part of the tank combat system. A future battlefield scenario might unfold like this. As the Mark I tank slowly probes its way across the trenches, German soldiers, armed with K rounds, prepare to penetrate its side. Suddenly, a barrage of grenades rains down from above. These grenades cannot penetrate the tank's armor, allowing French soldiers to throw them with confidence. They can throw one at any ditch, trench, or hole ahead to scare the enemy. After a loud bang, the infantry rushes forward with rifles, eliminating the enemy before they can even react to the explosion. In this way, even with K rounds, German soldiers would find it difficult to flank the Mark I, as they would face a barrage of grenades and rifles from the French infantry before they could even get close. Of course, throwing grenades requires standardized techniques and rigorous training, otherwise, it's easy to injure friendly forces or even oneself. This is part of infantry tank coordination. Charles looked up at Estienne and said, "It's not as simple as it seems. I hope you can take charge of its training." Estienne replied, flattered, "Yes, Lieutenant, I know what to do." But Charles calmly said, "No, you don't know what to do yet. This is only part of it. We should probably go to the first air group tomorrow." The first air group? Estienne's eyes gleamed with a strange light. Did this mean that aircraft would be involved in this battle? The Mark series tanks, due to their special shape and construction, have a strong trench crossing capability. Chapter 149. Did you do this on purpose? The rain fell quietly, sometimes heavy, sometimes light, occasionally stopping for a moment, but soon starting again in a light drizzle, seemingly endless. The 2-week deadline was drawing ever closer, and the railway had been completed ahead of schedule and officially open to traffic. To prevent the Germans from knowing when the tanks would be shipped from the Charles tractor factory, trains regularly entered the factory at 5 p.m. every night and departed at 5 a.m. the next morning, returning to Paris. They weren't always empty. Gallieni publicly claimed that the military had a long-term tractor and motorcycle purchase agreement with the Charles factory, and the railway was built to facilitate their timely delivery to the battlefield. This was at least partly true. The military's tractor demand was completely monopolized by the Charles factory. Although Francis had a factory and production line capable of producing 500 tractors per month, he dared not enter this market to compete with Charles. However, the true purpose of the train transport was to prepare for the Battle of Lapis. One day, Charles would transport not tractors and motorcycles, but tanks and troops, and no one would suspect it, thus preventing the Germans from determining the timing of Charles's attack. For the past week or so, Charles had been relatively free. He was in charge of training the troops to prepare for the attack on Lapix, so he didn't need to report to headquarters. That day, while Charles and Estienne were further discussing the coordination between the sidecar motorcycles and tanks, Laurent stepped forward and reported, "Lieutenant, the general wants you to go to headquarters." Charles was somewhat surprised. Gallieni had completely handed over the training to Charles and no longer interfered. Why was he suddenly being asked to go to headquarters? Charles told Estienne, and, with a puzzled look, got into the car with Laurent. On the way to headquarters, Charles suddenly guessed why Gallieni had called him, and a smile involuntarily appeared on his lips. He thought to himself that he was going to get scolded again. Sure enough, when Charles entered headquarters, Gallieni led him directly to the lounge. Gallieni picked up a newspaper from the table, turned and handed it to Charles, his voice low. "Aren't you going to explain?" Charles took the newspaper and saw a headline on the front page. Charles believes speed and mobility are among the most important indicators of a tank. Only in this way can it evade enemy fire. Gallieni stared at Charles, his eyes burning with anger, and asked, "Did you say this?" "I'm sorry, General," Charles replied, "I let it slip. This happened yesterday evening." Charles left work early before the troops finished training. With Destiny and Brownie in charge of the training, he had nothing to worry about. As soon as he stepped outside, reporters swarmed around him, shouting incessantly, "Lieutenant, General Joffre launched his third attack yesterday, but it was thwarted again. What are your thoughts on this? As the inventor of the tank, do you think this kind of attack was necessary? Do you think there's anything about their tactics that needs improvement?" Charles usually wouldn't answer any questions. It was a classified matter. Even uttering a single word could give the enemy a clue. Colonel Laurent cooperatively led his guards to clear the reporters away so Djokovic's car could pass. Before the car started moving, a reporter approached and loudly asked, "Lieutenant, many people believe your tanks are easily defeated. Is that true? Your refusal to participate in the bidding and your delay in deploying them to the battlefield, does this imply acceptance of this?" Charles couldn't hold back any longer and turned to reply, "Hasn't the battlefield already proven which tanks are easily defeated? But they think your tanks are no different." Finding his provocation effective, the reporter continued to entice Charles, "Many people think your tanks are even worse than theirs because it's obvious your tanks only have machine guns and no cannons, and far fewer machine guns." Charles replied dismissively, "Cannons and machine guns aren't important, that's precisely their biggest mistake. For a tank to have speed and trench crossing capability, it must first be able to get close to the trenches and reach the enemy. Only then can its weapons be effective, otherwise, it's destined to be easily defeated." The reporters erupted in an uproar. Many of them had written military articles for years and had some understanding of military affairs. They knew that if Charles's theory were followed, the CA-1 tank and the Saint-Chamond tank were undoubtedly on the wrong track. Then, after thinking about it carefully, they realized there was some truth to it. If tanks couldn't even get close to the enemy, what use were artillery and machine guns? They were just decorations. Instantly, reporters, seizing the opportunity, raised their cameras and started snapping pictures of Charles, then crowded in to ask, "So, do you think General Joffre's offensive should not continue? Do your tanks have the capability to defeat the enemy? Are you confident in your tanks?" If you were in command of this battle, Charles seemed to realize he had let something slip, and regretfully urged Djoka to drive off as if fleeing. Galleri, unable to contain his anger, pointed at the newspaper article with his finger and said sarcastically, "Now, your correct development strategy has been exposed to everyone, Lieutenant. Congratulations, many people believe you are right. You have once again become a hero of France, the only one who is right. The military and civilians now think that you should lead this battle. They say that everyone else is a fool who doesn't understand tanks, but," Galleri's face darkened, "have you considered that the Germans will also know what you've said?" "Yes, of course," Charles replied with a smile, his tone calm. "But you," Galleri paused, sensing something was amiss. After a moment's thought, he suddenly laughed. "You did this intentionally?" Charles nodded slightly. "Yes, General. My factory has too many spies. I can't eliminate them quickly enough, so this is the only way." Galleri's expression was strange. He remained silent for a moment, then nodded, sighing, "You lied to me, little guy. But I forgive you." Charles was stunned. Shouldn't he be considering whether to forgive him now? Then, without Charles being prepared, Galleri suddenly roared, "You actually told everyone such important intelligence, including our enemies. This is blatant espionage. Do you know what this means? We will pay a heavy price for this, not just tanks, but the lives of French soldiers." Chapter 150. Charles's tank is the real tank. In Lefis, another gloomy evening descended upon the German lines. The autumn wind, carrying icy rain, lashed at Colonel Jurgen Khalil, who tightened his coat and continued wading through the puddles. A squad of German soldiers were diligently bailing water out with their spiked helmets. Upon seeing Colonel Khalil, they quickly stopped and stood at attention in salute. "Don't stop, lads," Colonel Khalil said expressionlessly. "Bailing water is more important than showing me respect. They might kill you, but I won't." The soldiers laughed. Several ground squirrels, as large as cats, darted past. After spending time with them, they were no longer afraid of humans. Sometimes, corpses left uncollected would be found the next morning, mutilated beyond recognition. But Colonel Khalil was powerless against them. He muttered, "I'd rather face a French attack than this thing." "Hey," Colonel Khalil yelled at two soldiers slacking off below the machine gun emplacement, "if you don't want to get bullets, thicken your parapets. They're about to be washed away by the rain." The exhausted soldiers responded and frantically grabbed their entrenching tools, climbing up the muddy trench. Colonel Cowell gave them a few more warnings before turning into the communication trench. He walked a short distance deeper and arrived at the 2nd Infantry Regiment headquarters. Soaked to the bone, Colonel Cowell ducked inside. He had no intention of sitting down. He was worried about getting the last remaining dry spot wet, though that was only a matter of time. Colonel, just as Cowell stood at the entrance, nervously trembling, a staff officer carefully handed him a document. Colonel Cowell took the document and realized it was a newspaper. "What's this?" Colonel Cowell looked at the staff officer in confusion. The staff officer replied, "This is a newspaper brought from France by an intelligence officer. He thinks it might be useful to you." Cowell first put the newspaper aside, took off his raincoat and helmet to dry his hands, and then picked up the newspaper again and walked into the dim light. After only one glance, Cowell looked up at the staff officer in surprise. "Charles Tanks?" "Yes, Colonel," the staff officer replied. "Our intelligence officer said that after Charles said those words, he realized he had let something slip, and he hurriedly left the scene, and was then scolded by Gallery." Colonel Cowell nodded, turned his gaze back to the newspaper, and after reading it for a while, chuckled. "He's right. The tanks attacking us these days do have this problem. They wander around in front of us like blind men, firing randomly without seeing their targets, while we can easily destroy them. That's not the important thing, Colonel," the staff officer reminded him. Colonel Cowell paused, then nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Wolf. If Charles had known this, he wouldn't have made this mistake. So," the staff officer continued, "so his tanks must be much faster, making them harder for our artillery to hit. They might also have stronger armor, so even our K rounds might not be able to penetrate them." Cowell grunted. "That means his tanks will bring the French right up to us and unleash a hail of machine gun fire. We should be grateful that France has a foolish parliament, Colonel," the staff officer said. "They're the ones who phased out Charles's tanks and bought 2 non-tank tanks at exorbitant prices to charge at us. Otherwise, we'd be cold corpses by now." "That's right, Wolf," Cowell replied with a smile. "The French parliament saved us. It's just a pity I can't write them a thank you letter." The staff officer and several officers in the command post burst into laughter at this. "Now," Colonel Cowell waved the newspaper at the officers, "what we need to consider is how to deal with this tank, the Char's tank, the real tank." After a brief silence, Wolf was the first to offer an idea. "Although we need to increase our K-round stockpile, it doesn't seem like we can place too much hope on it." "Yes," Colonel Cowell tapped his finger in the air in agreement. "The Char will reinforce its frontal armor. Our K-rounds might not be able to penetrate it. The sides might be able to, but by the time we see the sides, the enemy infantry will already be in front of us." Colonel Cowell nodded to the recorder. "Write that down, Nig. We can't overlook any detail." The recorder responded and quickly jotted down the key point in the document. "Then it's just artillery," the staff officer continued to analyze. "But if the Char's tank also has speed." The command post fell silent instantly. They didn't know the tank's speed, and the target's speed was inconsistent and unlikely to be moving in a straight line. Artillery would be unlikely to destroy such an unpredictable target. After a moment's consideration, Colonel Cowell said, "Perhaps we can launch a wider area attack on the target, or fire in stages." Staged firing is an artillery tactic, essentially a modern-day coordinate system. It involves a gun group setting its firing parameters and conducting test firings before the battle to determine which area its shells will land in front of the position, thus preparing for engagement. When the battle begins, if an enemy target enters or is about to enter this area, a simple shout of "fire" over the phone is all it takes, and the shells immediately fire, turning the area into an inferno. Clearly, this method eliminates all intermediate steps, greatly shortening firing time and significantly improving accuracy. The drawback is that the gun group must remain in a ready-to-fire state at the set firing parameters and cannot fire at other locations, otherwise it becomes meaningless. Therefore, many gun groups are needed to perform this static coordinate system to potentially divide a wide battlefield front. Colonel Cowell muttered to himself, "We need more artillery, and lots of shells." Someone worriedly said, "There's a shortage of artillery and shells everywhere, Colonel." "They won't give us any." By this time, the defensive line was already secured, and the entire several hundred kilometers of the line was under combat. Coupled with the difficulties of transportation during the rainy season, such scarce resources as artillery and shells weren't something that could be obtained simply by wanting them. The staff officer silently picked up the newspaper from the table and waved it at everyone. Or, could we report this intelligence to General Waldeck and hear his thoughts? Colonel Cowell understood the staff officer meaning. If General Waldeck realized that Shah's tanks would launch an attack on the Lafis line, he would definitely be willing to transfer artillery. The second from the left in the image above is a K round. Usually each soldier is equipped with 5 rounds, and machine gunners are equipped with a belt of 250 rounds. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.